The weight of dog tags. The warehouse was already burning when Harlan Briggs came through the sidewall, not through the door. The door was gone, blown inward by the first explosion, and the frame was wrapped in a curtain of orange flame that pulsed like something alive. He came through the wall itself, through a section of corrugated steel that Roy Sims had spent 20 minutes loosening from the outside while the timer counted down, and nobody spoke about what they were all thinking. Harlan hit the concrete floor and rolled, came up on the prosthetic leg, found his balance the way he always did, by feel and muscle memory, and 23 years of learning to trust something that wasn't really his. Scout was already ahead of him, a gray-black shadow cutting through the smoke, nose down then up, reading the air the way no instrument ever built could read it. The heat was a physical thing. It pressed against Harlan's face like a palm being held too close. Somewhere above them, something structural groaned, and a section of roof decal sagged inward, glowing at its edges. He had maybe 4 minutes, maybe 3. Scout stopped, sat down. In the middle of the burning warehouse, with smoke pouring from 3 directions and the smell of chemicals mixing with the smell of burning rubber, the dog simply sat and looked to the left toward a section of the building that was still mostly dark, still mostly standing a row of old wooden shelving units stacked floor to ceiling with equipment crates. Harlan followed. He found her behind the 3rd row of shelving on the floor, with her back against a steel support column, one hand free, one still looped through a zip tie that had been anchored to a wall bracket. She was unconscious. 26 years old, red hair matted against her face, a cut above her left temple that had bled down her cheek and dried there. She was breathing. He cut the zip tie with the blade he'd carried on his right hip since 1987. He didn't think about it. His hands just did it the way hands do things after 40 years of being the hands of a man who never stopped preparing for the moment when preparation would matter. He lifted her. The prosthetic leg complained the way it always complained under unexpected load, a dull, grinding sensation that wasn't pain exactly, but was something adjacent to it, a reminder that some things couldn't be replaced, only approximated. He ignored it. Scout led them out, not through the wall they'd come in. That section was gone now, consumed in the 30 seconds it had taken to find her. Scout found a different way, a loading dock door at the far end of the building, steel roll-up padlock from the outside, but Forge had been busy on the perimeter, and the padlock was already cut, dangling open, and all Harlan had to do was pull the handle with the hand that wasn't carrying a young woman who weighed less than she should. He pulled it. Cold desert air hit him like a wave. He kept walking, kept moving away from the building on legs that were no longer entirely reliable, until he was 20 yards out, 30, 50, and then he let himself lower her to the ground, to the hard-packed Arizona dirt, and he knelt beside her and he pressed 2 fingers to her neck and felt the pulse there, steady and real. Behind him, the warehouse finished the process of becoming a ruin. The roof came down in sections. The explosions had stopped because there was nothing left to explode. The fire was talking to itself now. That low roar that fires make when they've found everything they're going to find and settled in for the long work of consuming it. Voiceover. A man doesn't choose his last mission. His last mission chooses him. That was 24 hours after Harlan Briggs rode into the town of Copperhead, Arizona on a Harley-Davidson that had more miles on it than most cars and carried exactly as many secrets. He didn't know when he crossed the town line at 2:17 in the afternoon of a Wednesday in October that the next 24 hours would ask him for everything he had left. He didn't know that a burning building and an unconscious young woman and a doe who never made a mistake were waiting for him at the end of a chain of events that had started 20 years ago in a different desert on the other side of the world. He knew only what the letter had told him, and the letter had told him enough. The desert highway stretched ahead and behind him, in both directions, a black ribbon unreeling through a landscape that had been red and ochre and burnt gold since before the country was a country. The kind of beauty that doesn't ask to be admired, just exists, indifferent and enormous, the way the best things in the world are often indifferent and enormous. Harlan had ridden through this stretch of Arizona more times than he could count, and he never stopped noticing it, the way the light hit the mesas in the late afternoon, the way the shadows pooled in the arroyos, the way the sky out here went so deep a blue it looked almost purple at the horizon. He was 67 years old. He had gray in his beard and a prosthetic left leg that started just below the knee and ended in a boot that had never touched a mine in Fallujah, because that mine had been designed to kill the man who stepped on it, and the leg had absorbed enough of that intention to matter. The leg was gone. The man was still here. He thought about that more than he talked about it, which was to say, he thought about it almost never and felt it almost always. Scout sat behind him in the custom-built sidecar, a German shepherd with a face like a judge and eyes that had been everywhere and forgotten nothing. 11 years old. The math on working dogs wasn't generous. Harlan didn't do the math anymore. On the handlebars, two dog tags hung from the mirror post, moving in the wind with the small, constant motion of things that have nowhere to be but can't stay still. One said Briggs Harlan J. USMC. The other said Carver Edward M. USMC. That second one had no business being there. It should have been in a box in Arlington National Cemetery, buried with the man whose neck it had rested against for 9 years. Instead, it had been pressed into Harlan's hand at a funeral in Virginia 20 years ago by a woman with white hair who would have been 61 then and was 81 now, and had written him a letter 3 weeks ago in handwriting that shook at the edges but was still underneath the shake. The handwriting of someone who meant every word. The letter was in his jacket pocket. He hadn't needed to reread it. The important parts were already somewhere behind his eyes. Harlan, I know it has been years. I know you carry things I cannot understand, but I need to see you. I have something Eddie left, something I have been carrying for 20 years and cannot carry alone anymore. It's about what really happened. Please come. The 20th anniversary is in 1 week. Please come before that. What really happened? He had turned those 3 words over in his mind for 3 weeks, turning them the way you turn a stone to see what lives underneath it. He had been there. He had watched his best friend die. He had stood at the funeral and accepted a folded flag on behalf of a country that owed Eddie Carver more than a folded flag, and he had driven away from that cemetery and kept driving for 20 years. What else was there to know? But Helen Carver didn't write letters like this without a reason. And a man didn't ignore a widow's request. Not this widow, not this man. He throttled down as the highway began to descend toward the valley where Copperhead sat in the shade of a mesa that hadn't changed its shape in 10,000 years. The town appeared gradually the way small towns in the desert appear, as if they're deciding whether to let you see them. A water tower first painted white with the town's name in letters that had faded from red to pink, then a cluster of rooftops. Then the main street, a strip of buildings that had been built in the 50s and maintained unevenly, ever since some of them fresh painted, some of them wearing their age, the way old people sometimes wear their age, not with embarrassment, but with a kind of dignity. This is what time does, and time comes for everything. Population 3,200. The sign said it, and the quiet said it louder. He crossed into Copperhead at 2:17 on a Wednesday, and by 2:18 he knew he was being watched. Not the way strangers are always watched in small towns, that ordinary curiosity that lifts eyes from tasks and follows an unfamiliar face down the street. This was different. This was focused. There was a man in a gray pickup truck parked outside the hardware store who was watching too carefully and looking away too quickly. There was a woman in the doorway of the insurance office who tracked the Harley for longer than the sound of its engine justified. Harlan had learned to read surveillance in places where surveillance preceded violence. He filed it away the way he filed everything, quietly and without reaction, and kept riding. Scout's weight shifted behind him. The dog had sensed it too. The Red Rock Diner sat on the corner of Main Street and Railroad Avenue, a low building with a neon sign that spelled Red Rock in cursive letters, 2 of which had burned out, so it read RE Rock, which sounded like something a geology professor might say. There were 4 vehicles in the gravel parking lot, and one of them was an ancient Buick that Harlan somehow knew was Helen's, the way you sometimes know things before you have any reason to know them. He parked, cut the engine, sat for a moment in the sudden silence, the particular silence that follows a long ride on a loud machine, the silence that feels like it has shape and weight. 3 taps on the left leg. Tap, tap, tap. He'd been doing it since the hospital in Germany the first time he stood up on the prosthetic and understood with the full weight of understanding that this was permanent. The doctors had told him the tapping was a way of confirming reality of telling the nervous system that what it thought was missing was actually present in a new form. He didn't know if that was true. He knew only that he did it before every journey and at the end of every journey, and that some habits were more than habits. Some habits were prayers. Scout jumped down from the sidecar with the ease of a much younger dog and immediately began a slow perimeter sweep of the parking lot, nose down, methodical, reading the day's history and what the ground had kept. Harlan swung his right leg over and shifted his weight to it, then brought the prosthetic around and found the ground and stood. His back popped in 2 places. His right knee, which had been held together by surgical wire and optimism since Kuwait in 1991, registered its standard complaint and was ignored. He straightened his jacket, Iron Brotherhood MC patch on the left chest, Tucson chapter, the lettering worn, but the symbol clear, a motorcycle wheel wrapped in chain, the design he'd helped sketch on a bar napkin 15 years ago. A man wore his colors. That was just how it was. The diner's door opened with a bell that was slightly off-key, the kind of bell that has been rung so many times it's forgotten the exact note it was supposed to make. Cool air washed over him, carrying the smell of coffee and the ghost of bacon from the morning rush, and something sweet that might have been pie. Vinyl booths along the windows, a counter with red stools, a glass case near the register that held 3 pies. Apple, cherry, pecan. The same 3 pies that every diner in America had held for 60 years. Harlan's eyes moved through the room in the way they always moved through rooms, a complete sweep in the time it took most people to blink, cataloging exits, assessing occupants, noting what didn't fit. He'd been doing it since 1981. He would do it until the day he stopped doing anything at all. There were 9 customers, a middle-aged couple in the second booth eating in the companionable silence of people who have been eating together for decades. 3 men in work clothes at the counter talking in low voices over coffee. An elderly man by the window reading a newspaper with the focused attention of someone who still respected the printed word. A family of 4, 2 parents and 2 young children in the large booth at the back. And in the far corner booth by the window that faced the mesa, a woman with white hair and a face that Harlan would have known anywhere. He'd seen Helen Carver last at Eddie's funeral 20 years ago. In his memory, she was a woman in her early 60s, still dark-haired, standing with the particular stillness of someone absorbing a blow they knew was coming but couldn't prepare for. The woman in the corner booth was 81. 20 years was in every line of her face, in the careful way she held her coffee cup in both hands, in the slight forward lean of someone who had grown accustomed to the weight of carrying things that couldn't be set down. But her eyes were the same, clear and dark and precise. The eyes of someone who had seen everything and kept her own counsel about all of it. Harlan walked toward her. Scout's nails clicked on the linoleum beside him, a quiet, steady rhythm. The prosthetic made a slightly different sound than his right foot, a sound that Harlan heard every time, and nobody else seemed to notice, and he'd long since stopped caring about the asymmetry. You made peace with asymmetry, or you spent your life at war with it, and he had enough actual wars in his past to know the difference. As he moved through the diner, he became aware of something. Scout had slowed. Not stopped, not yet, but slowed the way the dog slowed when he was processing something, when the information coming in was more than he was quite ready to act on. Harlan glanced at him and then followed the dog's gaze. The woman behind the counter, 58, maybe 60, dyed blonde hair pulled back, a name tag that read Norma. She was wiping down the counter with a cloth, a routine motion, but there was nothing routine in the way she watched Harlan cross the room. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't the territorial wariness of someone who regarded strangers as problems. It was something more specific than that. Something that looked to a man who had spent 40 years learning to read the specific language of other people's fear and guilt like recognition. She knew who he was. He hadn't been in this town in his life, but she knew who he was. He filed it, kept walking, reached Helen's booth and stopped. For a moment, neither of them spoke. 20 years of silence and grief and unanswered questions sat between them like a third presence at the table. Helen looked at him with those clear, dark eyes, and he looked at her, and then she smiled, and the smile was so much like the one he remembered from before the funeral that something in his chest shifted. Some weight redistributed itself, and he understood why he'd come. Harlan Briggs, she said, still riding that machine. Still breathing Helen, which is more than Eddie got. It came out harder than he'd intended. It always did when Eddie came up directly. Helen didn't flinch. She'd heard harder things from harder people, and she had outlasted all of them. Sit down, she said. Please. He slid into the booth. Scout settled at his feet, facing out alert, but still the way the dog could hold himself in reserve indefinitely when reserve was what the moment required. Up close, Helen looked frailer than her letter had suggested. Her wrists were thin inside the sleeves of her cardigan, and her hands showed the brownish spots of age and sun, and when she lifted her coffee cup, there was a faint tremor in the motion. But her eyes didn't tremble. Her voice didn't tremble. This was a woman whose body was catching up to her age and whose mind had refused to follow. Thank you for coming, she said quietly. I wasn't sure you would. You asked. That was enough. A waitress appeared. Young Harlan's first impression told him, though he revised that upward when he got a better look. 26, maybe 27. Red hair pulled back in a loose knot that was coming undone at the edges. A name tag pinned slightly crooked to her uniform that read Laurel. She was moving with the efficient competence of someone who had been doing this job long enough to make it automatic. and she was managing just barely to hold her face in a professional arrangement of welcome. Her hands, when she poured coffee into the cup she set in front of Harlan, were trembling in a way that was too fine to be called shaking, more like the trembling of a string that has been plucked and hasn't finished vibrating yet. He looked at her wrist as she poured. There was a bruise on the inner forearm, fading from purple toward the yellow-green that meant it was 4 or 5 days old. 4 distinct marks arranged in a pattern that a man who had spent his career learning to read bodies living and dead recognized without effort. 4 fingers. Someone's 4 fingers. Someone who had grabbed her wrist with enough force to leave marks that were still visible 5 days later. Scout's head lifted. Not dramatically, just the slight elevation that meant the dog had registered something and was filing it away with all the other things he registered and filed. "Can I get you anything else?" Laurel said. Her voice was soft and practiced and empty of inflection, the voice of someone who has learned to make their voice an instrument of professional efficiency and nothing more. "Just coffee, thank you." He kept his voice gentle the way he'd learned to keep it gentle around people who were maintaining something difficult at some cost to themselves. She nodded and was gone quickly, the way people are gone when they want to be somewhere that isn't here. Harlan watched her go, watched the way she glanced toward the kitchen as she moved behind the counter, a quick sideways look, checking something or checking for something. Helen followed his gaze. "She came back to take care of her mother," Helen said, her voice low. "Alzheimer's. Laurel has a degree in geology. Could be working anywhere. Came back to this. Somebody's hurting her." It wasn't a question. Helen's expression confirmed it wasn't. "This town has problems," Helen said. "It's had problems for a long time, since before Eddie died." "I didn't drive 4 hours from Tucson for a conversation about local problems, Helen." "No." She was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet her hands moved on the table in front of her, a small restless motion. "No, you didn't." From her purse, which was the kind of purse that a woman carries for 30 years because it was built to last and because she chose it carefully, and because some objects accumulate a loyalty that makes them impossible to put aside, Helen withdrew a small plastic rectangle, a USB drive, black featureless. She set it on the table between them, the way you set down something that has been heavy for a long time and that you're not sure you have the right to set down. "Eddie left this," she said. Harlan looked at it. He didn't reach for it yet. "What's on it?" "A video." She looked down at her hands and back up. "He recorded it 3 days before he died. I found it 6 months after the funeral. He'd hidden it in the house in a place we'd talked about years before after September 11th, when everyone was making plans for things they hoped they'd never need plans for." She paused. "I've watched it 50 times. Maybe more. And you never came to me with this. I tried other things first." Something in her voice had changed, hardened not with anger, but with the particular quality of old grief that has been lived with long enough to become simply the texture of everything. "I went to the FBI twice. I was told I was confused. I was told that grief does things to people's perception of reality. I was told to let my husband rest in peace." "And Nathan?" The name landed in the space between them, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "Helen's son, 38 years old. He had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, at least in the photograph that Helen kept on the mantel, which was the only way Harlan had ever known him. He'd been 12 at Eddie's funeral, a boy carrying a grief too large for a boy. "Nathan started asking questions last year," Helen said. "He'd been asking about his grandfather, Eddie's father. He wanted to know about the family, the history. I told him more than I should have." She stopped. "He was angry when I told him. He said he was going to find evidence, that he would expose the people responsible, even if no one else would. And then his brake line failed on Highway 89 coming down from the mountains. His car went off the road. The investigator said it was wear and tear on an aging vehicle." She looked directly at Harlan now, and her voice was perfectly level, the way a voice can be perfectly level when the words it carries have been carried so long that they no longer have the power to break what they've already broken. "Nathan was a mechanic. He rebuilt engines from scratch. He maintained every vehicle he owned with the care that some men give to their children. Brake lines don't just fail. No, they don't." The diner's bell rang. The door opened. The man who came through it was big, 6'2" at least, and the kind of broad that comes from physical work, the kind that settles into the shoulders and stays there. He wore jeans and boots, caked with red desert dust, and a flannel shirt with the sleeves cut off at the shoulders, and he had a face that had probably been good-looking in a blunt, uncomplicated way when he was younger and had since become something less appealing, a face shaped by the habit of getting what it wanted from people who were smaller or more afraid. He was maybe 35. He looked at the diner the way people look at rooms they think they own. His eyes found Laurel immediately. She was refilling coffee for the men at the counter, her back to the door, and she hadn't heard the bell. Or maybe she had heard it, and her body was doing the thing bodies do when they've learned that looking doesn't help. Laurel. He said it at a normal conversational volume, and it didn't need to be louder than that because the particular quality of that single word, the ownership in it, the casual certainty, made everything in the diner go slightly quieter around it, the way a stone dropped in still water silences the surface. She turned. The color left her face in the way that color leaves faces when something the body has been dreading has finally arrived. Travis, she kept her voice steady. I'm working, please. Travis Pruitt walked toward the counter. Not fast. People who feel completely certain they have all the time they need don't walk fast. He moved with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has never been told no by anyone who could make it stick. You think you can ignore my calls? He said it conversationally. He said it the way you'd say you think it might rain later, or you think I'll have the chicken. After everything I've done for you. Travis, please. She had backed up one step and then another, and there was nowhere left to back up to because the pie case was behind her. Scout raised his head. Harlan felt the shift in the dog's weight before he saw it, that subtle redistribution that meant Scout had moved from resting awareness to active attention. He didn't need to look down to know what the dog's posture was. He had memorized it over 11 years. Head slightly lowered, eyes fixed. Every muscle in the body quiet but awake. A stillness that was the opposite of stillness, a stillness that was all coiled potential. Helen leaned forward and said very quietly, "That's Travis Pruitt, the sheriff's son." Travis reached Laurel and took her arm. The same arm. His hand closed over the bruise that was already there, exactly over it, and Harlan had the cold, certain knowledge that Travis knew the bruise was there and that this did not constitute any kind of deterrent. "We're going to talk outside," Travis said, "right now. Let go." Her voice was small, diminished the voice of someone who has tried resistance before and knows what it costs. "Let her go." Harlan's voice cut through the room without being raised. He hadn't planned it. He hadn't decided. But some things were not decisions. Some things were just who you were, and you either were that person or you weren't. And 40 years of being a particular kind of man didn't leave much room for renegotiation in moments like this one. Travis turned. His eyes moved over Harlan the way they would move over an obstacle in a road. The gray beard, the leather jacket, the prosthetic leg visible below the table's edge, where the booth didn't quite reach. A slow smile spread across his face, the smile of a man who has just decided that whatever this is, it is manageable. "Who the hell are you, old man?" Harlan stood up, slowly, deliberately, with the particular unhurried quality of a man who has no performance to give and no impression to make, who is simply doing what he is going to do. The booth creaked as he shifted his weight and found his balance. Scout rose with him, standing at his left hip, and the dog was very still. "Someone who knows when a man's out of line," Harlan said. Travis released Laurel. He turned to face Harlan fully, and the calculation was happening behind his eyes, the rapid assessment that men like Travis make constantly, the evaluation of whether this is something that can be handled with the usual tools. "This isn't your business," Travis said. "I'm making it mine." The silence that followed had texture. The cook behind the pass-through window had stopped moving, a spatula frozen at chest height. The men at the counter were very carefully not looking at anything in particular, the specific careful not looking of people who understand that anything can happen and want to be as small as possible when it does. The family at the back booth had pulled their children close, and then the diner's bell rang again. The man who came through the door wore a sheriff's uniform. He was 60 or close to it, with iron gray hair, cut in a style that was practical rather than fashionable, and a face that had once been hard in the active way and was now hard in the settled way, hardness that had become structural. He had the shoulders of a man who had been genuinely strong and the stomach of a man who had spent too many years at a desk, and he wore his badge with the unconscious ease of someone who has worn it so long it has become part of the body. He took in the scene without any visible reaction, which told Harlan more about him than a reaction would have. Men who were surprised by things they found reacted. Men who had arranged for things to happen stood and assessed. "Cade," the sheriff said. "Just the name." Travis stepped back. "Just talking, Dad. No problem here." The sheriff's eyes moved to Harlan. They were flat and measuring cop eyes, but with something beneath them that Harlan recognized from a lifetime of watching people who were hiding the weight of things they carried. "You're new in town," the sheriff said, passing through, to where nowhere in particular. The sheriff smiled. It was the kind of smile that had no warmth in it at all, the kind of smile that was a message in a different language. "Well, enjoy your stay, Mr. Briggs, but don't overstay your welcome. Copperhead's a quiet town. We work hard to keep it that way." He knew his name. He hadn't introduced himself. Helen hadn't said it. But the sheriff knew his name, and he was saying it out loud in the way that people say things out loud when they want you to know they know them, when knowing is a kind of power, and saying it out loud is a demonstration of that power. Harlan held the man's gaze. "Good to know, Sheriff." He let it hang there. He didn't ask the man's name because he understood that the sheriff not offering it was also a message, and because some conversations communicated most effectively through what wasn't said. The sheriff turned to Travis and jerked his head toward the door. Travis went, but not before sending one final look toward Laurel, a look that was not a goodbye, but a promise, the promise that this conversation was paused and not finished, that the pause was at someone else's discretion and the continuation would be at his. The bell rang twice, then they were gone. The diner seemed to breathe out. Conversation resumed in a lower register than before. The cook began moving again. The men at the counter looked at each other and looked away. Laurel appeared at Harlan's elbow. Her hands were still shaking that fine invisible, unless you were looking trembling, and her voice when she spoke was barely above a whisper. "Thank you." A pause. You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did." He kept his voice quiet, even the way you keep your voice with someone who is holding themselves together by will and doesn't need the additional pressure of other people's emotion. "You all right?" She nodded, which was not the same as being all right, but was the only answer available to someone who was working a 12-hour shift and had nowhere else to be. She started to move away, then stopped and said something so quietly he almost missed it. "He'll come back. He always comes back." Then she was gone through the swing door into the kitchen, and Harlan sat back down across from Helen and looked at the USB drive still sitting on the table between them. Helen was watching him. "You just made an enemy." "Wouldn't be the first time." "These aren't the kind of enemies you're used to, Harlan. The Pruitts have been here for 3 generations. The sheriff, his family, their connections. If they want someone gone, then I'll leave when I'm ready." He picked up the USB drive. It was warm from sitting in Helen's purse, a warmth that felt oddly like it was coming from something contained inside the plastic rather than from the temperature of the leather. He turned it over in his fingers. "After I watch this, after I understand what Eddie knew." Helen looked at him for a long moment, something moving behind her eyes, some calculation or assessment or recognition. Whatever she saw in his face seemed to satisfy her. "My house is 2 miles north on Route 9, she said. "Blue mailbox. The paint's faded. You'll see the porch light." She started to stand, moved carefully to her feet, and Harlan stood with her because that was how he'd been raised, and because some habits were right regardless of circumstances. She was reaching for her purse when she stopped and looked at him again, and this time the thing in her eyes was more specific, more urgent. "Harlan, whatever you decide after you see it, whatever you think you can or can't do, I don't need a hero." She said it carefully as if she had practiced it. "I just need someone to know the truth." Eddie deserved to have someone know the truth. "I'll watch it tonight," he said. She nodded, turned. Walked toward the door with the careful deliberateness of someone who counts every step but doesn't make a show of it. Harlan left $20 on the table for the coffee he'd barely touched. At the door he paused, and without quite meaning to, he looked back toward the kitchen window. Laurel was visible through the small rectangular pane of glass set into the swing door, just her face watching him go. The look in her eyes was the thing that stayed with him as he pushed out into the Arizona afternoon. He'd seen that look before on different faces in different places. A woman in a village outside Fallujah who'd looked at a Marine patrol the same way. A kid in Kuwait who'd tracked their convoy until it disappeared over a rise. Hope, specific and fragile and a little desperate. The hope of someone who has been waiting for something to change and has almost stopped believing that things change, and then a stranger walks in. He didn't know what to do with it. He put it with all the other things he didn't know what to do with in the place where those things lived. The afternoon sun had moved. His Harley sat where he'd left it, chrome catching the light. Scout jumped up behind him without being asked, settled in, weight distributed with the ease of perfect familiarity. Harlan started the engine. The sound of it rolled through the quiet of the parking lot and up the face of the mesa, and came back slightly changed by the rock slightly wider, like an echo of something bigger than itself. He pulled out onto Main Street heading north. As he passed the sheriff's office, a low brick building with a parking lot that held two cruisers and a gray pickup that he recognized from earlier in the afternoon, he saw a figure in the window, standing still, watching. Sheriff Emmett Pruitt. Harlan didn't look away. The sheriff didn't look away. Two men watching each other across 30 feet of Arizona Street, and between them all the things that had been set in motion and couldn't be unsaid. Then the Harley carried him past, and the sheriff's office was behind him, and the road opened up ahead. He found Helen's house easily. The porch light was on, and the blue mailbox was visible from the road, the paint sun-bleached to something close to gray, but still blue enough to count. He parked beside her Buick, which was cooling and ticking gently in the way that old cars tick. Scout jumped down and moved immediately to the perimeter, reading the property's history in the dirt. The house was small and solid and tired, the kind of house that had been built with the intention that it would stand for 100 years and was now passing the halfway point with some wear, but no fundamental loss of integrity. A porch that sagged slightly on the left, clapboard siding that needed paint in places, window boxes with dead flowers still in them, forgotten in some autumn's grief. Helen was on the porch when he reached it, holding the door open, and inside the house smelled like old books in the particular sweetness of lavender sachets that some women use, and photographs covered every available surface. Eddie in his dress blues, young 20-something, grinning the way young men grin in photographs when they don't know yet what's coming. Eddie and Helen on their wedding day, both of them caught in the act of laughing, and you could see in that photograph everything you needed to know about who they were and what they had and how much the thing that was coming would cost. A boy with Eddie's jaw holding a baseball bat, Nathan maybe 13, looking at the camera with the slightly skeptical squint of a kid who knows he's being photographed and isn't sure he approves. Harlan looked at those photographs and felt the weight of 20 years settle on him like a coat that had been hanging on a hook for a long time. He didn't try to shake it off. "Coffee?" Helen asked. "Please." The computer was on the desk in the corner of the living room, an old machine, a Dell that had been new when Dell was what people bought, running an operating system that had outlived its manufacturer's support. Daniel had set it up for her, Helen told him as she moved through the kitchen, the careful back and forth of coffee preparation voice carrying over the sound of water. Harlan sat at the desk. The USB drive was in his hand. He had been carrying it since the diner, been aware of its small weight, its warmth, the way a thing can feel heavier than it is when you know what it contains. He pushed it into the port. The machine took a moment to register it, an old machine deliberate in its processes. Then a window appeared, one file. Its name was 2 words, insurance.m4vi. He looked at that name for a moment. Eddie had known, had understood 3 days before he deployed to Fallujah that what he was recording might be the last record of what he knew and who was responsible for what he knew. Had named it the way a man names something when he's trying to protect the people he loves. Harlan double-clicked. The media player opened, buffered. Then the screen filled with Eddie Carver's face. 20 years collapsed. He looked older than Harlan remembered him, older than the photographs on Helen's walls. Not by decades, but by something harder to measure than years, a kind of exhaustion that settled in the eyes, in the set of the mouth, in the way a man holds his face when he's carrying something he can't put down. The video quality was poor, shot on a small camera in low light, Eddie sitting in a vehicle with the camera propped on the dashboard. Behind him through the windshield darkness. The timestamp in the corner read March 15th, 2006, 11:47 p.m. "If someone's watching this," Eddie said, "then I'm already dead." In the kitchen, Helen made a sound that was too small to be called a gasp. More like the sound a person makes when a wound they'd stopped expecting to reopen opens again. Harlan didn't look away from the screen. Eddie talked for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. He talked about coming home on emergency leave when his father died. About finding a ledger in his father's things, dates and amounts and initials that hadn't meant anything at first and then had meant everything. His father had been a civilian contractor at an army depot outside Phoenix. Logistics. For 15 years, he'd been part of a system that diverted military hardware, marked for destruction, moving weapons through a network of civilian contractors into the black market. Machine guns, grenades, equipment that ended up with people who used it to do the things that equipment was designed to do. And the man who coordinated it. The man whose initials appeared on every page of the ledger. The man who had been their commanding officer, who had pinned medals on their chests and given speeches about honor and duty and the debt this nation owed its fighting men. Colonel Virgil Denton. Eddie had confronted him, had gone to Denton directly, told him what he'd found, told him he had evidence. And Denton had laughed, said the ledger wasn't enough, said a dead man couldn't testify, said Eddie was deploying to Fallujah the following week where IEDs were everywhere and Marines died every day. It would be a shame, Denton had said, according to Eddie's account, his voice dropping so that Harlan had to lean toward the small speakers to hear it, if something happened to you. In the kitchen, Helen had stopped making coffee. Harlan could hear her stillness. Eddie kept talking faster now. He had people Denton did, engineers who could place devices, intelligence officers who could send patrols to wrong locations. In a war zone where bombs were part of the landscape where young men died every week, and each death was its own terrible statistic, an additional death could be arranged in a way that no one would question. So I'm making this insurance. Eddie leaned toward the camera, and even through the poor quality of the recording, even through 20 years of waiting, his eyes were the eyes Harlan had known, that particular quality of decision that Eddie had always had the ability to look at something terrible and choose to walk toward it anyway. If I die over there, if a bomb gets me or a sniper or anything that looks like combat, you need to know it wasn't an accident. He paused. Behind him through the windshield, something changed. Headlights appeared in the far distance moving. I'm hiding this drive at the house, Eddie said. Connie knows the spot. His voice changed on her name, a slight roughening, a texture that wasn't there otherwise. Helen, if you're watching this, I'm sorry. I'm so damn sorry I couldn't find another way. He picked up the camera. The image became motion fragments, the ground and the sky in the interior of a vehicle. Then it steadied on something outside. A warehouse lit by floodlights. A semi-truck backing to a loading dock. 4 men waiting. Eddie was zooming in as best the camera allowed. And even through the grain and the shadow and the compressed footage of 20 years ago on failing storage media, Harlan could see the men at the loading dock, could see the military-style crates coming off the truck, could hear Eddie's voice muttering the stenciled numbers on the crates, reading them off in the low, urgent way of a man who understands that this might be the last evidence he ever gathers. And then Eddie zoomed in further, on one of the men. A man who was younger than maybe 40, still carrying himself with the authority of office, still in the posture of someone who expects to be obeyed and has rarely been disappointed. Even through the bad footage, even through the years, Harlan knew that posture. He had stood in formation in front of that posture. He had saluted it. And then one of the other men on the loading dock said something and turned, and the floodlights caught his face at an angle that the camera recorded. Harlan stopped the video, went back 10 seconds, watched again. He had never met this man face to face. He had no reason to recognize a face he'd never seen. And yet, something cold moved through him. Not shock, something older and quieter than shock. Recognition of a pattern he hadn't known he was looking for. He knew the shape of that face. He'd been looking at it for 30 years in a different context. In a uniform. In a small framed photograph on the wall of a man's office. In a county seal and on a squad car door and on a badge pinned to a chest. Younger. Thinner. 30, maybe 35. But the jaw was the same. The set of the shoulders was the same. The way the man stood, feet slightly apart, slight forward, leaned the posture of someone who believes the ground beneath his feet belongs to him by right. Harlan sat back from the screen. Outside, the desert had gone fully dark, the kind of dark that comes quickly in the southwest stars appearing in their millions, against a black that had depth to it, that went on in a way that reminded you of how small the lights were. Helen appeared in the doorway from the kitchen. She held 2 cups of coffee, and she was looking at him, and she already knew from the quality of his silence that he had seen what she had seen when she first watched the video all those years ago and all the 50 times since. You see it, she said. It wasn't a question. He looked at the frozen frame on the screen. At the younger version of a face he'd seen this afternoon, they're now thicker in the jaw, wearing a badge and a uniform, and the casual ease of a man who had been safe for a very long time. How long have you known, he asked. Since the second time I watched the video, 3 months after Eddie died. She set one of the cups on the desk beside him carefully and stood holding her own. He was younger, but I'd seen him around town. I knew his family. I'd known who he was since before Eddie was killed. You've been living in the same town as the man who helped cover it up. For 20 years. For 20 years, she said. Yes. The silence that followed had the particular quality of silence that follows a revelation that changes the geometry of everything, that rearranges the known facts into a different pattern, that explains more than the original pattern did and is also much more dangerous. Sheriff Emmett Pruitt, the man who knew Harlan's name before they'd been introduced. The man who had arrived at the diner just as his son was threatening a young woman who had looked at the scene with flat, assessing eyes and made no visible judgment about it. The man who had smiled his smile that was not a smile and told a stranger to enjoy his stay and not overstay his welcome. The man who 20 years ago had been standing on a loading dock at midnight, helping unload military hardware that was supposed to be destroyed. Harlan looked at Helen and she looked at him, and Scout, who had come in from outside and settled in the corner of the room, raised his head and looked at both of them in the way he sometimes looked at things, with that calm, complete attention, as if he were confirming that they had understood what they needed to understand. Voiceover Eddie Carver saved my life in Fallujah. He walked into fire so I could walk away. I spent 20 years carrying the debt of that, the way men carry debts they can never fully repay. I thought I understood what I owed him. I was wrong. I didn't understand yet what it would cost to pay it. I didn't understand what the paying would look like. I was starting to understand, but I wasn't there yet. That would come. It would all come. But first I had to make a phone call to a man in Tucson, a man they called Wrench, who hadn't asked me a question I couldn't answer in 20 years of brotherhood. First I had to say the words out loud. I'm in trouble. I need backup. Someone was murdered and I'm going to find out who did it, and I'm going to make it mean something. That's what I'm going to do. That's all there is. He picked up his phone. He dialed. It rang twice. Wrench, Harlan said. I need you. Pine Ridge, Arizona. Something's not right here. A pause, the sound of someone setting something down on a workbench, the small, precise sounds of a man rearranging his priorities. When and where, Buckholt said. Not a question. Copperhead. Tomorrow morning. And bring everybody. Another pause. Shorter. We'll be there, Buck said. That's all there is. Harlan ended the call. He looked at the USB drive still in the computer's port, at the frozen image on the screen, that younger face in the floodlights' glare, at the 2 cups of coffee steaming gently in the dark room, at Scout in the corner, watching everything, forgetting nothing. Outside, the desert held the kind of silence that predates civilization, that will outlast it, that has no interest in the small, heated concerns of the creatures that move across its surface. The stars were enormous. The mesa was a black shape against a slightly less black sky. Inside the house, the photographs of a dead man watched from their frames. Eddie at 20, Eddie at 30. Eddie at 45, sunburned and grinning beside a man who was standing now in Eddie's wife's living room, holding a cup of coffee that had gone slightly cold, making plans in his head that weren't fully formed yet, but were forming the way plans form when a man has spent his whole life getting ready for something and has finally arrived at the something. I'll stay tonight, Harlan said, if that's all right. The guest room's been ready for 20 years, Helen said. I always thought you'd come eventually. He nodded. 3 taps on the left leg. Tap, tap, tap. Still here, still standing, still paying the debt. The night settled in around them, and in the morning 5 Harleys would come rolling down the highway from Tucson, and something that had been waiting 20 years to be set in motion would finally begin to move. They came at first light. Harlan heard them before he saw them, the way you always heard brotherhood coming. Before you saw them, that low collective rumble that started somewhere at the edge of perception and built slowly into something you felt in the chest as much as the ears. He was standing on Helen's porch with a cup of coffee when the sound reached him, and Scout, who had been sitting at the edge of the steps watching the road, turned his head toward it with the precise, unhurried attention of someone who already knew what was coming and was simply confirming it. 5 headlights appeared on Route 9. Moving together, evenly spaced the way brotherhood rode when they were riding with intention, each man holding his position in the formation, with the unconscious discipline of people who had done this long enough that the habits of order lived in the body and didn't require thought. They pulled into Helen's gravel drive in a line and cut their engines one by one, the sound dying in sequence, and in the silence that followed, Harlan could hear the desert waking up, the particular morning sounds of a high desert and October wind, in the dry grass, a bird somewhere in the scrub, the cooling tick of 5 engines. Buckholt climbed off first. 65 years old and built like something load-bearing, wide through the chest and shoulders, in a way that had more to do with a lifetime of physical work than with any Jim Gray beard hanging halfway down his chest, hands dark with decades of oil that soap had never quite fully reached. He walked toward Harlan with the rolling gait of a man who had spent more hours on a motorcycle than in a chair, and regarded this as a reasonable set of priorities. He looked at Harlan for a moment without saying anything. Then he looked at Scout, then back at Harlan. You look like you haven't slept, he said. I slept 2 hours. That's not sleeping. That's resting your eyes. He gripped Harlan's hand, the hard, dry grip of a man who meant it. You called. We came. Tell us what we're walking into. The other four had dismounted and were moving in the way they always moved in an unfamiliar situation, spreading slightly, each man naturally finding a position that let him see something different from what the others were seeing. Chet Stokes, who had been patching Marines back together in field hospitals since before some of the men they'd served with were born, was already scanning the property's perimeter with the quiet professional attention of someone who assessed risk the way other people assess the weather, constantly and without drama. Pete Decker, who had the road name Ghost for reasons that became apparent the moment you noticed how he could cross a space of ground without appearing to move through it, had positioned himself near the corner of the house where he could see both the road and the back property. Roy Sims was looking at the house itself, at the structure of it, reading its bones the way he read the bones of everything that was built, understanding it through its construction. Cal Monroe stood slightly apart from the others, tall and thin, and entirely still, and wearing the mild expression he always wore. The expression that looked like serenity from a distance, and was up close the face of a man who had made a complete peace with whatever was coming. People sometimes mistook his calmness for detachment. They were wrong. Cal Monroe was the most attentive person Harlan had ever known. He simply didn't perform his attention. Helen came to the door in a cardigan and carried herself onto the porch with the careful deliberateness of someone who refused to let their body make their decisions for them. 5 large men in leather jackets immediately straightened. You could take the man out of the Corps, as the saying went. The rest of it applied. "Ma'am," they said. It came out at roughly the same moment from 5 different mouths, and Helen looked at them all with those clear, dark eyes, and something shifted in her face, some long-held tension, releasing slightly, as if the simple fact of their presence had done something that no amount of private endurance had managed. "You boys come inside," she said. "Coffee's hot." They sat around Helen's kitchen table in the living room beyond it, 5 large men in a space that had been designed for a family of 3, and Harlan stood at the edge of the room and told them everything. The letter, the diner, Eddie's video, Nathan, the mine, Denton, and the man on the loading dock and the footage, the face he'd had to watch 3 times before he was certain of what he was seeing. The brothers were quiet through all of it. Nobody interrupted. Nobody asked questions that couldn't wait. They listened the way men listen when they understand that they're being given all the information at once, and that processing it as it arrives is more important than responding to any individual piece of it. When Harlan finished, the room held its silence for a moment. Then Buck looked around at the others. Something passed between them, a communication that required none of the usual mechanisms of communication. 20 years of riding together, of knowing each other in the specific way that people know each other when they've been in bad situations and come out the other side, had made certain conversations unnecessary. "So we're going up against a colonel," Buck said slowly, "a sitting sheriff, and whoever else Denton has on payroll. And we've got a 20-year-old video and whatever Nathan Carver had before they ran him off a mountain road. That's the situation." Buck looked at Chet, who nodded, looked at Pete, who shrugged in a way that meant the same thing as a nod, looked at Roy and Cal, who both waited. "All right," Buck said, "where do you need us?" Something moved through Harlan then, something he would not have named because he didn't generally name things like this. But it was relief, and beneath it something older than relief, the particular feeling of a man who has been carrying weight alone and feels for the first time in a while other hands on the rope. He told them what he needed: Ghost and Forge to the mine north of town reconnaissance. Only nothing aggressive. He needed to know what they were dealing with physically before anything else. Buck to Phoenix Attorney General's office. A woman named Patricia Weld, whom Buck had known since his Navy days, and who, according to Buck, had turned down enough money from enough people over enough years that she was probably the only truly incorruptible official within 300 miles of Copperhead. Chet to the diner, to Laurel Voss. "She's scared," Harlan said. "She's young and she's smart and she's been managing alone. Don't approach her like she's a victim. Approach her like she's a witness. There's a difference. She'll know the difference." Chet nodded. He had been approaching people in crisis since 1978 and had learned early and permanently that the manner of approach was more than half the work. Cal and Harlan would handle the diner that night. But not yet. First, they needed to know more about what they were actually dealing with, because the shape of the problem was becoming clearer, but the full extent of it was still in shadow. The Brotherhood dispersed with the quiet efficiency of people who had a shared understanding of the work, and no need to make a ceremony out of beginning it. Engines started, gravel moved under tires. Then they were gone, and Harlan was back on the porch with Scout and Helen in the morning heat already building toward the day's particular severity. Helen stood beside him and looked at the empty road. "You trust those men," she said. "Not a question." "With everything I have." She was quiet for a moment. Eddie had men like that, men who would have walked through fire for him. She paused. He died anyway. I know. He looked at the dog tag hanging from his jacket, which he'd moved there from the Harley last night out of habit, the way you bring certain things inside when you're spending the night somewhere unfamiliar. But this time, we know it's coming. Chet Stokes arrived at the Red Rock Diner at 9 in the morning wearing civilian clothes. No patch, no leather. Just jeans and a flannel shirt and the mildly weathered face of a man who was old enough to be unremarkable and experienced enough to use that unremarkability as a tool. He ordered eggs and coffee from the morning waitress, a middle-aged woman who was not Laurel, and he ate slowly and thoroughly and waited. Laurel came on at 10. Chet watched her without appearing to watch her, the practiced peripheral attention of someone who had spent a career in situations where direct observation was a provocation. She moved through her opening routine with efficiency, checked her section, spoke briefly with Norma Tillman, who was behind the counter doing something with the register. Something in the interaction between the two women caught Chet's attention. He filed it. He waited until the diner had thinned out the mid-morning lull between the breakfast rush and the early lunch crowd, and then he caught Laurel's eye and said he could use more coffee when she got a chance, and when she came with the pot, he said quietly without looking up from his cup, "I'm a friend of Harlan Briggs. He asked me to check in on you." She kept pouring. Her hand was steady. Her voice when she answered was neutral and professional in the way that voices are neutral and professional when the person using them is deciding whether to trust something. "I don't know anyone by that name. Man came in yesterday with a German Shepherd. Sat with an older woman in the back booth. Told Travis Pruitt to let go of your arm." She finished pouring, set the pot down on the table, which was not what you typically did with a coffee pot, and she stood there for a moment looking at the table rather than at him. "What does he want?" "Nothing from you. He wanted to make sure you were all right." "I'm fine." "I know you're not," Chet said, not unkindly, "but that's all right. You don't have to be fine for our purposes." He looked up at her then. "You came back here with a geology degree to look after your mother, and you've been doing something else too while you've been here. Something that has Travis Pruitt's father very interested in your continued silence." She looked at him for a long time. Long enough that another customer 3 tables over glanced at them and then looked away. "Follow me," she said. She led him to the small employee break room off the kitchen, a space barely large enough for a table and 2 chairs and a wall of metal lockers. She retrieved a laptop from her locker and set it on the table and opened it without preamble, the way people open things when they've been waiting for the chance to show them to someone. 4 months, she said. I started collecting samples in June. Grid pattern, 47 sites across the BLM parcels north and east of the Copperhead city limits. She turned the laptop so he could see the screen. A map covered in colored markers, each one corresponding to a numbered site in the spreadsheet beside it. The lithium concentrations in the upper deposit layers are consistent with a commercially viable spodumene formation. Conservative estimate based on surface sampling alone is somewhere between $12 and $18 billion at current lithium futures pricing. Chet looked at the map, at the spreadsheet, at the photographs of sample sites, each meticulously labeled with GPS coordinates and collection dates. The permits for the mining operation north of town, Laurel continued, are registered to a company called Copperhead Mineral Holdings, LLC. I pulled the incorporation documents from the state registry. The registered agent is a law firm in Scottsdale. The firm's client list on the public portions of their website includes 3 other shell companies that all trace back to the same source of capital. She paused. I don't know whose capital it is, I couldn't get that far. But the permits themselves are wrong. The environmental impact assessments are fabricated. I have the originals from the BLM database and I have what was submitted to the state, and they're not the same documents. You knew all this before yesterday. I've known for 6 weeks, and you haven't gone to anyone with it. She looked at him steadily. Nathan Carver went to someone with it. He drove off Highway 89 2 months later. She closed the laptop with a quiet, decisive click. I've been waiting for someone to come who wasn't from here, who didn't already owe somebody something. Chet called Harlan from the parking lot. His voice when he spoke was the same measured calm it always was, but underneath it was something else, the specific quality of a man who has just understood that the situation is larger than the initial briefing suggested. She's got the evidence, Chet said, scientific, documented, formatted in a way that would hold up in a federal proceeding. She's been sitting on it because she was afraid, and she was right to be afraid, but she's not passive, Harlan. She's been building a case. She just needed someone to hand it to. Harlan listened, said very little, thanked him. He sat with that for a while, sitting on Helen's porch in the October sun scout beside him, thinking about a 26-year-old woman who had spent 4 months walking BOLM land with a sample kit and a GPS unit collecting evidence against people who had already demonstrated a willingness to kill for what she was documenting. Thinking about the kind of quiet courage that didn't announce itself, that just did the work day after day without anyone watching. The kind of courage that looked like ordinary behavior from the outside. The kind that most people never recognize because it didn't come with a moment of decision you could point to. It had just been a choice made and then remade every morning for 4 months. He was still thinking about it when Buck called from Phoenix. Buck's voice on the phone had a particular quality when he had something significant to report. A slight slowing down, a deliberateness of pacing that was the opposite of his normal manner, which ran fast and direct. It was the voice of a man being careful about the weight of the words he was choosing. "Patty Weld sends her regards," Buck said, "and she gave me something I didn't ask for, which means it's either important or she wants something. With Patty, usually both." "Tell me." The FBI field office in Phoenix opened a case in 2005. Official designation, I won't bore you with the reference number. The case was based on a complaint filed by a private citizen regarding possible weapons diversion from a military logistics facility. The citizen provided documentation, including a video recording and a handwritten ledger. Harlan's grip on the phone tightened slightly. The case was assigned to a special agent named Randall Cook. Cook investigated for 3 weeks, interviewed the complainant twice, and then filed a closure memo stating that no credible evidence of wrongdoing had been found, that the documentation provided was consistent with legal disposal activities, and that the complainant appeared to be suffering from complicated grief following a recent bereavement. Buck paused. "Those are the official words. Complicated grief." "Helen," Harlan said. "Helen. She went to them, Harlan, twice. She did everything right. She drove to Phoenix, she walked into the field office, she handed over everything she had, and Randall Cook buried it." Another pause. "Cook retired in 2009. He lives in Scottsdale now. Nice house, nicer than a retired federal agent's pension should comfortably afford. Patty's looked at some of his financials, the ones that are accessible. She's had reasons to look before, apparently for other reasons. There's money there that doesn't have a clean explanation." The phone line carried a silence that both of them knew the meaning of. "It wasn't that there wasn't enough evidence," Harlan said. "The evidence was good enough. The evidence would have been more than enough. It was buried by someone who was paid to bury it." Buck's voice had gone flat in the way it went flat when he was controlling something. 20 years, Harlan. She went to them and they sent her home and told her she was imagining things. And Cook cashed his check. What does Patty need? Physical evidence from the current operation, something she can attach to the historical record, something that connects Denton to what's happening now. She can't reopen a 20-year-old case on a video that was already evaluated and closed, even with the corruption angle, not without something current to hang it on. But if she has current evidence of an ongoing criminal enterprise, she can come in with everything: the arms dealing, the murder, Nathan's death, all of it under a new umbrella. How soon can she move? She can have a team in Copperhead in 4 hours from whenever I call her. She's been waiting for something like this, Harlan. She told me that. She said there have been rumors about this corner of Arizona for years. Money moving in ways that don't make sense, permits being issued for land that shouldn't be permitted. She just didn't have a thread to pull. "We'll give her a thread," Harlan said. He ended the call. Sat for a moment looking at the mesa to the north, at the hard line it made against the sky, the absolute clarity of it in the desert light. The way it had been exactly that shape for 10,000 years, and didn't care what happened at its feet. Ghost called at 3 in the afternoon from a ridge position north of the mining operation, speaking in the low, unhurried voice of a man who had spent years in situations where volume was a liability. "Substantial infrastructure," he said. "Main processing, building, north warehouse, 3 smaller outbuildings, a generator complex. The mine entrance itself is about half a mile further north, recent access road, heavy equipment. The whole operation is fenced chain link with razor wire, 1 main gate with a guard post, 1 service entrance on the east side." A pause. 6 private security personnel that I can count. Armed. Not rent-a-cops, Harlan. These are professionals. Military background in most of them, from the way they move and hold their positions. They're rotating, covering the perimeter. Activity level. High and getting higher. They've been moving equipment since this morning. Looks like they're preparing for a significant shipment or preparing to move everything out, or both. Another pause longer. There's something else. North Warehouse has external wiring that doesn't connect to the generator complex. Independent circuit. Could be security, could be lighting. Harlan understood what could be. Stay on position, he said. Don't engage. I need you there when we move. Forge's call came 20 minutes later from a different angle on the same position. He had been looking at the same installation that Ghost was watching, but Forge looked at things the way engineers looked at things, which was to say he looked at the structure and read the story the structure told. That North Warehouse was modified recently, Forge said. 3 months ago, maybe 4, based on the weathering on the new materials. Somebody added reinforcement to the eastern and northern walls, poured new concrete around the foundation perimeter. That's not standard for a warehouse that's already standing. He was quiet for a moment. You reinforce a structure when you expect it to contain something volatile, or when you expect it to resist a significant event. Harlan didn't ask him to explain further. He didn't need to. The afternoon moved through its long shadows toward evening. Helen made sandwiches that neither of them particularly wanted, and they sat at her kitchen table and ate them because the body required maintenance regardless of circumstances, and because there was a particular discipline in taking care of the ordinary things when the extraordinary things were gathering at the edge of everything. Scout ate his dinner from the bowl Helen had found at the back of a cabinet, the bowl she'd kept there for 20 years because Eddie had always said they should get it and had never gotten around to it, and using it now seemed right in a way she didn't try to articulate. At 9 in the evening, Harlan put on his jacket. You don't have to do this tonight, Helen said. She's been carrying information about this operation for 6 months, and she's been alone the whole time. She needs to know what she's dealing with. She needs to know there are people who can take the information somewhere safe. He picked up his keys. And I need to know what she knows. Harlan, he turned. Helen was standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room, and she was looking at him with an expression that was hard to read. Layered, complicated, the expression of someone who has been waiting for something for a very long time and is watching it finally begin to arrive, and is not entirely sure whether to feel relieved or terrified, or whether relief and terror in this particular situation amounted to the same thing. Bring her back safe, Helen said. Whatever else happens, bring the girl back safe. Yes, ma'am, he said. The Red Rock Diner was quieter at this hour, the dinner rush long past, a handful of late customers scattered through the booths, the low hum of a place running down toward closing time. The neon sign outside cast its particular half-broken light across the parking lot, 2 of the letters still dark, the remaining letters giving the building a name that sounded like something else. Harlan came through the door at 11:45, and the bell did its off-key announcement, and Norma Tillman looked up from behind the counter. She looked at him for just a fraction of a second too long. Scout came through the door behind him. And then Scout did the thing. He walked to the center of the diner, exactly to the center, the geometric middle of the checkered linoleum floor, and he sat down, not at Harlan's side, not near the door or near a booth. He walked to the middle of the room and he sat down and he turned his head and he looked directly at Norma Tillman, and he did not look away. The conversations in the booths around them did not stop immediately, but they thinned the way conversations thin when something in the room has changed and people can feel it before they understand it. A man at the counter looked at the toy and then looked at where the dog was looking. A couple in the booth by the window glanced up. One by one, without anyone deciding to, the diner went quiet. Norma held her cloth against the counter. Her expression was the expression of a woman trying to maintain a surface over something that was pressing upward from underneath. Harlan walked to a stool at the counter and sat down. Coffee, he said. Please. She poured it. Her hand was steady, but the steadiness cost something. Your dog all right? She asked. The professional voice, the voice of a woman who had run this counter for 30 years and could hold a conversation with anyone about anything and make it sound normal. He's working, Harlan said. Working on what? He's trained for threat detection. Harlan looked at his coffee cup, then up at her. He detects things most people would miss. People who mean harm, for instance. He's very good at it. The color in Norma's face shifted by several degrees. Harlan reached into his jacket pocket and set his phone on the counter. The screen showed a frozen frame from a video. A warehouse at night, floodlights, a semi-truck backed to a dock, figures standing near military crates. He'd cropped it to show the figures clearly, including one woman on the periphery younger than she was now, but recognizable. Norma looked at it, looked away, looked at it again. I don't know what that is, she said. You do, he said. Not unkindly, not with anger, just as a statement of fact, the way you state facts that aren't in dispute. You've known what it was for 20 years. You've been making a decision every single day for 20 years. The diner was very quiet now. The remaining customers had gone still with the instinctive stillness of people who can feel that something is happening that has nothing to do with them, but that they are somehow witnessing. Scout had not moved, had not blinked as far as anyone could tell. He sat in the middle of the floor and he looked at Norma Tillman with the focused, complete attention of 11 years of trained attention, and it was not threatening exactly, but it was absolutely without ambiguity. You called him, Harlan said, last year. When Nathan Carver started asking questions around town, started talking to people who'd worked at the depot and the mine started coming too close to things that certain people needed to stay buried. You called Virgil Denton or someone who reports to him, and you told them what was happening. Norma's hand on the counter had stopped pretending to wipe. 2 weeks after that call, Nathan drove off Highway 89. Harlan's voice remained level. He was 38 years old. He was going to be a father. That last detail he had learned from Helen last night quietly at the end of a conversation about Nathan as a person rather than Nathan as a victim. Helen had said it the way people say things they've had to learn to say without it destroying them every time. You made one phone call, and that's where it ended up. A sound came from Norma then, something between a breath and a word that didn't quite make it all the way to being either. Her eyes were bright. He said it would be handled quietly, she said. Her voice was very low. He said Nathan would be talked to, warned off. That was the word he used, warned. And you believed him. I wanted to believe him. She set the cloth down on the counter, folded her hands on top of it with the careful precision of someone controlling something. I've been telling myself for 20 years that I didn't know what I was involved in, that I just kept my eyes open and reported what I saw, and that what other people did with the information was their business. But you knew. I knew. She said it simply, quietly, like a confession that has been waiting its turn for a long time and is relieved in some exhausted way to be spoken. I knew when they told me what happened to Eddie Carver. I told myself it was the war. I told myself it was coincidence. I've been telling myself a lot of things for a long time. The back door opened. Sheriff Emmett Pruitt came through it. His hand was on his service weapon, but it wasn't drawn, and behind him his deputy, a man in his 30s with the nervous energy of someone who had not signed up for whatever this was becoming, came through and stopped 2 feet inside the door. Pruitt took in the room. The dog in the center of the floor. Norma's face. The phone on the counter with its frozen frame. Harlan sitting on the stool. Step away from her, Briggs, Pruitt said. Harlan didn't move. She was just telling me some things. I said step away. Your informant, Harlan said, still not moving, still keeping his voice at the same measured register. Just told me she called Denton when Nathan Carver was getting too close to the truth about what happened to Eddie. 2 weeks later, Nathan's brake line failed on Highway 89. He turned on the stool to face Pruitt directly. You going to arrest her for that? Or are you going to pretend you didn't hear it? Pruitt's jaw was tight. His eyes moved from Harlan to Norma to the phone on the counter. Harlan picked the phone up, opened the video file, let it play. The poor quality footage of a warehouse at night, the figures at the loading dock, the military crates coming off the truck. He held it up so Pruitt could see the screen, and then he advanced the footage to the frame he had found last night, the frame he had watched 3 times before he was certain of what he was seeing. The younger face in the floodlights glare. 35 years old, standing at the loading dock of a warehouse in the Arizona desert at midnight 20 years ago. The jaw was the same. The set of the shoulders was the same. Pruitt went very still. Not the controlled stillness of a man managing his reaction. The involuntary stillness of a man who has had something happen inside him that requires the body to stop moving while it processes. Where did you get that? He said. His voice was flat. Eddie Carver recorded it 3 days before he deployed to Fallujah. He named the file Insurance. He hid the drive in his house because he knew Virgil Denton was going to have him killed, and he wanted there to be a record. Harlan looked at the sheriff, and the sheriff looked at the frozen image on the screen. Denton told you Eddie died in combat, an IED, a tragedy of war. He lied to you too, Emmett. Something moved in Pruitt's face, a shifting or reconfiguring the internal motion of a man reassessing something large. Eddie Carver was killed because he found the ledger, because he found out about the weapons diversion and confronted Denton, and Denton couldn't let him testify. He had people in theater who could arrange things. IEDs were everywhere in Fallujah in 2006. One more Marine dying and one more explosion was just one more line in one more report. Harlan stood up from the stool. slowly the way he always moved when he was choosing to communicate something through the manner of his movement. You've been protecting a man for 20 years who murdered your county resident on foreign soil, who had your witness eliminated so cleanly that even you couldn't have testified if you'd wanted to, because there was no one left to say what Eddie knew. You don't know what you're talking about. I know you're not the one who ordered it. I know you've been in this long enough that getting out started seeming impossible somewhere around year 2, and after year 2, it just became the shape of everything. He stepped toward Pruitt slowly, hands at his sides. But I also know that right now, tonight, you're standing in a room where a woman just confessed that she made a call that led to a young man's death. And you're thinking about what that means for you, because if she goes down for it, the question of who she was calling on behalf of becomes a question someone asks. The deputy shifted uncomfortably near the back door. He was looking at the floor with the focused attention of a man who wants very badly to not be part of this conversation. Pruitt said nothing. Harlan's phone buzzed. He looked at it. A text from Pete Decker, 3 lines of words that were short and specific in the way Pete was always short and specific because he had learned that in the dark and at distance, economy of language was a survival trait. North Warehouse, C4, substantial. Timer set for 0200 hours, 90 minutes, someone locked inside. Female. Cannot get a positive ID from this angle. Harlan read it twice. The second time was not because he hadn't understood it the first time. He looked at Pruitt, and he could see in the quality of the man's expression when Harlan's face changed in the reading of the message that Pruitt understood something significant had just arrived. "Where is Laurel Voss?" Harlan said. Pruitt's eyes moved. "The waitress, 26 years old, geology degree, red hair." Harlan's voice had changed, not louder, not harder. Something else, a clarity, a compression, the voice of a man stripping every unnecessary element from what he was saying because there was no time for anything except what mattered. "Where is she right now?" "I don't know where." "Think carefully. Your son has been following her for weeks on Denton's instructions because she's been collecting geological evidence on the BLM parcels, and Denton knows it. She didn't come to the diner today after her shift ended. She didn't go home. Because if she'd gone home, Chet would have called me." He held up the phone, the text from Pete still on the screen. "North Warehouse, C4, 90 minutes. Female inside." "That's her. That's Laurel Voss locked inside a building that Virgil Denton has rigged to burn." The silence in the diner had the specific quality of silence that arrives when the stakes of something become undeniable. "He said she'd be relocated," Pruitt said. He said it quietly, almost to himself, in the voice of someone who recognizes as the words are leaving their mouth that they bear the words of a man who has been told what he wanted to hear. "Protective custody. He said she was a liability and she'd be moved somewhere safe." He lied. Harlan picked up his keys from the counter. "The same way he lied about Eddie, same. The same way he'll lie about you when the time comes and you become more useful to him in a box than on a payroll." He looked at Pruitt and he did not look away. "You know what kind of man he is. You've known for 20 years. The question is, what kind of man you are tonight." Pruitt stood there with 20 years of wrong decisions stacked behind him and 90 minutes of clock in front of him, and a face that was doing the visible work of a man who has arrived at the specific moment when everything he has been avoiding becomes the only thing there is. "If I help you," he said slowly, "Denton will. Denton is being arrested tonight regardless of what you do. Patricia Weld from the state AG's office has a team standing by in Phoenix. 4 hours out. Everything she needs is already on its way to her." Harlan moved toward the back door. "The only question left is whether there's a girl alive to testify when they get here." Pruitt looked at his deputy. The deputy looked back at him. The younger man was frightened visibly the way young men are frightened when they realize that the choice their superior is making will determine what they are required to become. But he didn't move toward the door. He didn't reach for his radio. He stood there and waited for the man who was supposed to tell him what was right. Pruitt made a sound that was not quite a word. Then he unholstered his service weapon, checked the chamber, reholstered it. It was a small and practical action. It said everything that needed to be said. "Service entrance on the east side," he said. "I have the key code." "Then let's go." They came out of the diner into the cold October night. The 3 of them and Scout moved ahead of them across the gravel, with the focused purpose of a dog who has been waiting all day for the moment when waiting became moving. The sky above Copperhead was enormous and clear. Stars spread from horizon to horizon in the particular abundance that only comes this far from city light, this deep in the desert where the sky hasn't been bleached pale by the glow of other people's lives. Harlan sent 3 text messages in the time it took to reach his bike. "Ghost, Reverend, Forge. Chet. Move now, North Warehouse. Full approach. Meet at the service entrance east side. 90 minutes. Buck. Call Patty Weld. Tell her we have a live situation. Tell her we need her team in Copperhead in 4 hours. Tell her it's everything she's been waiting for. Helen. Stay inside, lock the door. Don't open it for anyone until I call you. He started the Harley. The engine roared in the night, that sound that had been his companion for 40 years, through all the versions of himself he had been and all the miles between them. Scout settled behind him. 93 pounds of trained attention and absolute loyalty, 11 years old and ready. As they pulled out of the Red Rocks parking lot past the half-dark neon sign and past the empty parking spaces and the ordinary quiet of a small town at midnight, Harlan thought about Laurel Voss. About 4 months of walking BLM land, alone collecting samples, building a case, maintaining the kind of daily unremarked courage that doesn't have a name because the people who practice it are too busy practicing it to give it one. About the look in her eyes at the diner that first afternoon, that look he'd recognized and filed and carried since. He thought about what Helen had said that morning. Bring the girl back safe. He pushed the throttle. The Harley surged forward north toward the mesa, toward the mine, toward a warehouse with a timer counting down in the dark. Pruitt's cruiser came behind him, lights off, running dark, and his deputy behind that. And from the north, 2 sets of headlights already moving, Ghost and Forge, coming down off the ridge, where they'd been watching all day, converging on the same point, the way things converged when they had been set in motion by the right combination of necessity and will. Voiceover. There's a kind of fear that doesn't make you smaller. The kind that arrives when you understand that something important is in danger. Something worth more than your comfort and your safety and your very reasonable concerns about what happens to old men with prosthetic legs who ride motorcycles into situations they weren't invited to. That kind of fear is just information. It tells you what you value, and what you do with it tells you who you are. Eddie Carver had that kind of fear in a warehouse parking lot 20 years ago. He'd felt it, and he'd kept filming anyway. The least a man could do was show up for the next part. The desert road opened ahead of him, straight and dark, and certain, running north toward the mountains where the lithium lay in its billions, and the clock ran down in the dark, and a 26-year-old woman waited, maybe not knowing whether anyone was coming, maybe knowing the way people sometimes know things without anyone telling them. He rode. Scout's weight was steady behind him, and the dog tags moved against his chest, and the stars overhead were the same stars they'd always been, old and cold, and completely indifferent to the urgency of what was happening beneath them. Which was fine. He'd never needed the stars to care. He just needed 4 more miles of road. Semper Fidelis, the mine road, had no name on any map. It branched off the county highway 3 miles north of Copperhead, at a point marked only by a galvanized steel gate and a no trespassing sign that had been there long enough to rust at the corners. The gate was open. Someone had left it open, which meant either they expected traffic or they'd stopped worrying about who came in because they'd already decided nobody was getting out. Harlan killed his headlight 100 yards before the turnoff. Behind him, Pruitt's cruiser went dark at the same moment the deputy's vehicle. A half second after that, the 3 of them moving through the desert night on instinct and whatever ambient light the stars provided, which was enough. The moon was a thin crescent, low and orange, near the horizon. In the desert at distance, that was enough to see by if you knew how to see, and every man in this convoy had learned to see in conditions worse than this. Scout shifted his weight behind him. The dog's body had changed in the last mile, a subtle tightening, the gathering of attention that Harlan had learned to read the way other men read weather or the behavior of shadows. Something ahead, something that mattered to the dog in the specific way that certain things mattered to Scout, and that Harlan had learned over 11 years and several thousand miles of road to take seriously without question. The mine installation came into view around a long curved floodlights on the main building, and the guard post casting hard yellow light that made the surrounding darkness seem absolute by contrast. 2 guards at the main gate, both visible, both alert, both holding their rifles with the relaxed hands position of professionals who didn't need to perform readiness, because readiness was simply what they were. 4 more on the perimeter, according to Pete's count from the ridge. The north warehouse sat at the far left edge of the installation, a large steel structure set slightly apart from the main building, its exterior dark except for a single work light above its roll-up door. Harlan stopped the bike, cut the engine, let the silence settle. He checked his watch. 67 minutes. From the south, 2 more headlights appeared on the mine road, moving carefully, and he knew them by their spacing, that particular interval that Pete and Roy kept between bikes when riding close, each man giving the other exactly enough room and not an inch more. They stopped 30 yards back, and Pete materialized out of the darkness on foot, arriving at Harlan's side with the quality of movement that had earned him his road name present without seeming to have traveled any distance to get there. Two on the main gate, Pete said. Three on the north and west perimeter. One went inside the main building about 20 minutes ago and hasn't come back. He was reading the installation the way former snipers read everything in distances and angles, and the relationship between light and shadow as one continuous calculation. North Warehouse has a chain on the roll-up, but the personnel door on the east side is steel electric lock. Wiring runs to an independent panel on the exterior south wall. Forge. Roy Sims appeared from the other side, already studying the installation with the systematic attention he gave everything built by human hands. I can take the panel. Give me 4 minutes, and that door opens. You've got 3. Roy's expression didn't change. Then I'll work faster. Cal Monroe and Chet Stokes came up the road on foot, having left their bikes half a mile back. Cal moved with his characteristic absolute calm, the calm of a man who had made a decision long ago about what merited his anxiety and had found the list to be very short. Chet carried his kit, the battered canvas bag that had held field medical supplies since the Corps and had been used as such on occasions Harlan didn't need to catalog right now. 6 people and a trend on a dirt road in the Arizona desert, 66 minutes from a detonation that was not going to happen. Harlan looked at Pruitt. The sheriff had climbed out of his cruiser and was standing beside it with his hand resting on his service weapon and the expression of a man at the edge of something that has no going back. Not the edge of a decision. That decision had been made in the diner, but the physical edge of what the decision meant, the place where choice became action and action became the rest of your life. Service entrance on the east side, Harlan said. Code 0315. Harlan stopped. He had heard that number before, had read it in a timestamp on a video file, small white numerals in the corner of a dark frame. March 15th, 11:47 p.m. Eddie Carver's birthday was March 15th. Helen had mentioned it the night before in the way people mention the specific dates of people they have loved automatically, because those dates remain in use even when the people who own them are gone. Denton had used the birthday of the man he'd ordered killed as the access code to the place where he locked his problems away. He turned that over for one moment, the particular cruelty of it, whether deliberate or simply the careless arrogance of a man who had stopped thinking about the people he'd destroyed as people, and then he put it away. Later. Everything that deserved time would get time later. East side, Harlan said. We go in quiet. Pruitt, main gate. 2 guards, you know their protocols. You've got a reason to be here at midnight that they'll accept for the 30 seconds we need. And if they don't accept it, then we improvise. But they will. Because you've been here before, and they know your face and the authority you're wearing is real, even if how you've used it hasn't been. He looked at the man. Use it right this once. That's all I'm asking. Pruitt absorbed that, then he got back in his cruiser, started the engine, drove toward the main gate with his lights on, casual official, a sheriff making a late-night pass by an installation he was paid to protect. The gate guards straightened when the cruiser's headlights reached them. One walked to the driver's side window. Harlan watched the exchange from his position, reading the body language, at distance the slight relaxation in the guard's posture when he recognized Pruitt, the hand coming off the rifle. A brief conversation, a gesture toward the main building. Pruitt's cruiser rolling through. The guards returned to their positions. Neither looked toward the east side. Harlan moved. They came around the perimeter fence at a ground-level depression where the terrain dropped away and the chain link didn't quite reach the earth, a gap Pete had found from the ridge that was exactly large enough for a man and a dog to pass through without snagging. Roy went first, then Chet, then Harlan, then Scout, who moved through gaps and fences with the fluid ease of a creature who understood his own dimensions with perfect precision. Cal and Pete held the outside covering angles, maintaining the external conversation that every approach required. The east wall of the north warehouse was in shadow, the work light on the opposite side unable to reach around the building's mass. Roy found the electrical panel in the darkness by his hands moving over the surface with the practiced confidence of a man who reads physical structures the way other people read text. He had the panel open in 40 seconds, spent another 90 seconds working inside it by feel and the thin beam of a penlight held in his teeth. The lock on the personnel door clicked. 61 minutes. The door swung inward on darkness and the smell reached them immediately. Cold concrete, machine oil, industrial chemicals stored in an enclosed space. And beneath those, something else. A smell Harlan had encountered in specific tactical situations in Iraq, a smell that lodged in the memory and stayed there permanently the first time you met it. Play-Doh and almonds, the distinctive chemical signature of C4 in quantity. Scout's body went rigid. Not the seated alert he used in open spaces. The standing alert, head forward, every muscle focused and directional, pointing into the dark interior with the absolute certainty of 11 years of trained instinct and a nose that could detect trace concentrations of compounds that no instrument built by human hands had ever matched. He barked. Once, sharp directional aim toward the far left corner of the interior. Then he moved. Harlan followed him through the darkness, through a maze of equipment, crates, and shelving units, guided by the sound of Scout's movement ahead and the slight shift of air against his face that indicated walls and turns. Chet moved close behind. Roy held the door. They moved the way they had moved in bad places before, quickly and without noise, because the combination of those two things was what the situation required, and the situation was always what it was. Scout stopped at a steel door, set into the back wall of the warehouse, reinforced, the kind of door added to a structure not originally designed to contain people. The modification Roy had seen from outside and understood immediately. A keypad on the wall beside it, its green indicator light the only illumination in this section of the building. Harlan's hand found the keypad. 0, 3, 1, 5. The lock released with a sound that was entirely ordinary for what it represented. A small mechanical click, the sound a key makes in a lock. The door opened inward. The room was small, concrete walled, lit by a single bare bulb on a cord. The chemical smell was stronger here. In the upper corners, partially concealed behind a length of industrial shelving, Harlan could see the brick-like forms of C4 charges, 4 visible from the doorway, wired in a configuration that Roy would later describe as competent but not elegant, the work of someone who knew enough to build a functioning system, but not quite enough to build an efficient one. The timer was a digital unit attached to the assembly. Its red numbers read 58 minutes and were declining by seconds. Laurel Voss was on the floor in the center of the room. Her hands had been zip-tied behind her back and the tie looped through a steel bracket bolted to the wall. Her mouth had been covered with a length of duct tape that ran from cheekbone to cheekbone, but her left hand was free. Not free of the zip tie itself, the plastic band still tight around her wrist, but free of the bracket worked loose from the anchor point by effort and time and whatever she'd been using to work it with. Her left arm was extended, fingers spread on the concrete floor, and there was a small nail beside her right knee that she had been using as a tool. She looked up when the door opened. Her eyes moved from Harlan to Chet, to the space behind them, and then to Scout, who crossed the room in 3 strides and pressed himself against her side. She got her free arm around the dog's neck and held on with the grip of someone who has been alone in a bad place for hours and has just been handed the first solid thing they've touched since arriving there. Harlan knelt, cut the remaining zip tie with the blade from his right hip, peeled the duct tape away carefully, the way you handle something that matters. She pulled in a full breath, coughed once. Then she looked at him with eyes that were wet and exhausted, and something else underneath the exhaustion, something that had not been diminished by hours in a concrete room with a countdown timer in the corner. "I was almost out," she said. Her voice was rough from the tape. "I know." He helped her to her feet. She took her own weight as soon as she had it, which was immediately. "Can you walk?" "I walked in here." Behind them, Chet was already at the C4 assembly, examining it with the calm, methodical attention of a man who had dealt with improvised devices in conditions considerably worse than a locked room in Arizona. He looked at it for 30 seconds without touching anything, and then made a small sound that was not quite a word. "Primary timer wired to a receiver," he said. "Backup system. Probably a second backup." He looked at Harlan. "Pete needs to be in here." Harlan keyed his radio. 1 press. The code they'd established before entering 1 press, meaning inside situation developing, send ghost. 40 seconds later, Pete Decker was in the room, moving past Harlan and Laurel without a word, going directly to the assembly, crouching beside it, with the focused economy of a man who understood that in this specific context, precision and hurry were incompatible, and precision was the only thing that mattered. Chet guided Laurel toward the door gently, and she went. But she looked back once at the room, at the timer, at the man crouching beside it with a penlight in his teeth, and her expression was that of someone making a complete accounting of what they have survived so it can be properly acknowledged later. Harlan stayed. Pete found the primary receiver in 4 minutes, the backup in another 3. The third system, smaller than the others, concealed behind a panel in the false bottom of one of the shelving units, took 7 minutes and cost him a layer of skin on the back of his right hand when the housing came loose unexpectedly. He showed Harlan all 3 units. each one with its wire cut, 51 minutes remaining on a timer attached to nothing. They moved out of the warehouse into the desert air, and Harlan stood for one moment looking up at the sky at the stars in their abundance, unchanged by any of what had just happened, exactly where they had always been. He breathed the cold air, felt his left leg's complaint from the uneven concrete floor, and didn't mind it at all. Chet had Laurel against the warehouse's east wall checking her head wound with his penlight, asking her questions in the low measured voice he used when assessing someone who needed to know they were being taken care of without being made to feel diminished by the taking care. She was answering him steadily, eyes tracking his light. No concussion symptoms that immediate examination could identify. Then the main floodlights came on. All of them at once. The full perimeter lighting of the installation blazing to life, and in the sudden brightness, everything was exposed. The 6 of them against the warehouse wall. The disabled personnel door behind them. The open section in the east fence where Roy had brought down a segment to allow exit. A voice came from a loudspeaker mounted on the main building's roof. Calm, measured. The voice of someone who had occupied positions of authority for so long that authority had become the resting tone of everything he said. Sergeant Briggs, I should have known a direct approach wouldn't be sufficient. Harlan turned. Colonel Virgil Denton stood at the corner of the main building where the floodlight's edge created a clear boundary between the lit zone and the shadow beyond it. 70 years old and carrying them the way certain men carry age, not as reduction, but as accumulation, as if each decade had added something rather than taken it. He was broad through the chest upright, and the way he stood with his feet planted at shoulder width and his shoulders set was the posture of a man who had given commands for 50 years and had never found reason to doubt that the commands would be followed. He held a small black unit in his right hand, the detonator, not the receiver-based timer in the warehouse. A direct signal unit handheld, the kind of redundancy that a thorough man builds into any system he intends to be certain of. Step away from the warehouse, Denton said, not into the loudspeaker now, his own voice carrying in the cold air with the ease of a voice that had been trained to carry across parade grounds and briefing rooms and the noise of active operations. All of you, hands where I can see them. Harlan stepped forward, away from the wall, away from the others, into the open space between the warehouse and the main building. Scout moved with him to his left side, and the dog did not assume any posture of engagement. He simply moved with Harlan the way he always moved with Harlan, as if their movement were a single thing pressed through 2 separate bodies. Let them go, Harlan said. This is between you and me. Denton looked at him with the evaluative patience of a man who has been reading other men his entire professional life and regards the process as neither urgent nor interesting, simply necessary. Then he said, Nothing is between you and me, Sergeant. You are a problem I should have resolved 20 years ago alongside Eddie Carver. You could have let him live. He would have destroyed everything. He had a wife. Harlan's voice remained level, the same register it had held all night. The voice of a man who had removed performance from the situation because the situation didn't need it. He had a son, he had a life that belonged to him and to the people who depended on him, and you decided that life was expendable. He paused. You were his commanding officer. He trusted you with the things soldiers trust commanding officers with, which is the only thing that actually matters. Something moved in Denton's face. Not guilt, not the simple thing that word implied. Something more layered than that. The expression of a man who has made a complete accounting of his choices and arrived at a number he has lived with long enough that living with it has become its own kind of answer. You want to understand, Denton said. I want you to let these people walk out of here. In 1991, Denton said, as if Harlan had agreed to something, as if they were beginning a conversation that had been scheduled for 30 years and had simply been waiting for the right location. I commanded a company in the Euphrates Valley during the ground offensive. 22 men. I knew every name, every family, every letter they were writing home. He paused. His eyes were steady, looking at something beyond Harlan, or at something inside the distance, rather than the distance itself. CENTCOM sent us into a forward position based on intelligence that 2 separate field officers had flagged as compromised. The grid coordinates were wrong by 4 kilometers. His jaw set. 16 of my men walked into a Republican Guard armor formation that nobody at the command level admitted to knowing was there. They died in an Iraqi ditch because a man at a desk made a calculation and nobody at that desk paid a single thing for it. You filed a report, Harlan said. I gave testimony. I provided documentation. I was thanked for my service and told the inquiry had been reviewed and closed. Something hardened in his voice, an old hardness, the kind that sets over decades into something structural. The matter was closed. My men were closed. 16 names on a wall somewhere that their families visit once a year, and the rest of the country drives past without slowing down. He looked at Harlan directly now. The system has been failing its men since before either of us put on a uniform. I stopped waiting for it to change. I decided to take what I was owed, what they were owed. By selling weapons to cartels, Harlan said, by putting machine guns and grenades into the hands of people who used them on civilians who never had anything to do with the Euphrates Valley or what happened to your men. By using what I built to build something lasting. Your accounts in the Cayman Islands, your property in Costa Rica. Harlan took one step forward. Just one. Your 16 men are still dead, Virgil. Everything you built didn't change that. It just added more names to the list. Denton's thumb moved toward the detonator's switch. Eddie Carver had a wife who spent 20 years trying to get someone to listen, Harlan continued. He had a son who died on a mountain road at 38 years old because he was trying to finish what his father started. He had a grandchild he never knew he was going to have. You say the system failed your men. Eddie Carver's family would understand exactly what you mean. He looked at Denton steadily, without anger, without performance. That's what makes it unforgivable. You knew what that loss cost. You knew it from the inside, and you chose to make it happen to someone else anyway. A silence fell over the installation. The floodlights hummed. Somewhere beyond the perimeter, a desert creature moved through dry grass and was gone. I built something that has lasted 30 years, Denton said. Denton, you are a retired sergeant with one leg and a dog riding around the country looking for causes because you cannot determine what to do with yourself and now that the wars are over. Don't lecture me about what is and isn't forgivable. You're right, Harlan said. I'm not here about forgiveness. He looked at Denton and he did not look away. I'm here because Eddie Carver pushed me out of the way of a fireball in Fallujah and died so I could keep walking around with my prosthetic leg and my dog and my very questionable decision-making. I spent 20 years not being able to pay that back because I didn't know what paying it back looked like. And then Helen wrote me a letter and I got on my bike and I drove to Copperhead and now I'm standing in your floodlights at 1 a.m. and I understand now what it looks like. He paused. It looks like this. It looks like tonight. It looks like your operation ending and Helen Carver finally being able to grieve her husband without the weight of an unresolved wrong underneath the grief. Denton pressed the switch. Nothing happened. The expression on his face in that moment was very specific. Not confusion. The recognition of a man who has built redundancies into every system for 50 years and has just understood for the first time that someone has found every one of them. He pressed the switch again. Still nothing. A third time. From the darkness at the corner of the main building, Pete Decker stepped into the floodlight's edge. He was holding 3 separate units. The primary receiver, its wire cut cleanly. The first backup, its casing opened and its internal components separated. The third system, small enough to fit in a jacket pocket, its wiring fully extracted and coiled separately. Pete held all 3 up in one hand, not triumphant. Simply factual, the way a man presents evidence that speaks for itself and requires no commentary. Found all 3, he said. Forge says your backup wiring was Army surplus from the 90s. Sloppy work for a colonel. Denton looked at the 3 dead units, at the detonator in his own hand that was now simply plastic and circuitry connected to nothing. He looked at it for a long moment, and in that moment, something in the architecture of the man showed its age, showed the cost of its construction, showed where the foundation had been wrong from the beginning, and had stood anyway on power and will, and the willingness to destroy whatever needed destroying. Then the lights changed. From every approach to the installation, from the main road and the service road, and the 2 tracks along the perimeter fence, headlights appeared. 12 vehicles, and as they came through the gate and took positions around the main building, they resolved into the dark SUVs and marked vehicles of the Arizona State Police Tactical Unit. The men who came out were wearing gear, indicating they had arrived with a specific understanding of the situation. A woman came through the main gate on foot. Mid-40s, dark suit, badge case in her left hand, carried with the ease of 2 decades of use. She walked to the center of the installation with the unhurried directness of someone whose preparation had been thorough and whose moment had arrived. She took in the scene. Denton with the useless detonator, Pete with the 3 disabled receiver units, Harlan in the open ground between them. Scout, who had maintained his position at Harlan's left side through all of it, still now watching everything, recording it in the way he recorded things completely and without gaps. Colonel Virgil Denton, she said. I'm Patricia Weld, Arizona State Attorney General's office. You are under arrest. The charges include weapons trafficking, murder in the first-degree conspiracy to commit murder, money laundering, fraudulent procurement of federal permits, and approximately 28 additional counts that will be read to you in full once you've been processed. She looked at the detonator. I'll need that. Denton didn't move for a moment. He stood in the floodlight with the dead detonator in his hand and 50 years of choices arranged behind him, all of it collapsing now into the simple physical fact of this ground and these lights and these hands reaching toward him. Then he held the detonator out. A tactical officer took it. A second moved to Denton's side with handcuffs and the practiced efficiency of someone for whom this was the end of a long process rather than the beginning of one. Denton submitted to the handcuffs without resistance. He kept his posture, kept his eyes forward, kept the bearing of a man who had decided that his dignity was the last thing he controlled and that he would not give it away in this particular moment. He said nothing as he was led toward one of the state police vehicles. He walked straight, and he kept walking straight until the vehicle door closed behind him. Harlan watched him go. He reached into his jacket and found Eddie's dog tag warm from being against his chest, worn smooth from 20 years of handling. He held it in his fist for a moment. Didn't say anything out loud because the thing he needed to say didn't require sound to reach the person it was intended for. Some distances aren't crossed by sound. He opened his hand and looked at the tag. Edward M. Carver, the metal so worn the letters were shallow, now rubbed down by years of being touched. Then he put it back against his chest where it had lived for 2 decades and turned back to the work that remained. Patricia Weld appeared at his side. Your friend, Mr. Holt, delivered everything, she said. The documentation your group assembled, combined with material we've been building independently for 3 years. Federal charges will hold. She paused. The FBI agent who closed the 2005 complaint, Randall Cook. He's in Scottsdale. We'll have him before morning. Helen Carver filed that complaint, Harlan said. She drove to Phoenix. She sat across a desk from that man and handed him everything she had, and he told her she was imagining things. He told her to let her husband rest in peace. I know. Weld's voice was careful. I know exactly what happened. I want her to know that it has been fully accounted for. She paused. I'd like to tell her that myself if she'll see me. She'll see you, Harlan said. She's been waiting 20 years for someone in an official capacity to say it wasn't her imagination. That's worth a visit. Pruitt was standing beside his cruiser at the edge of the installation. 2 state police officers waited nearby with the patient, non-aggressive proximity of people who had been told to wait and were waiting. He had not been handcuffed. His service weapon had been taken. He was looking at the ground. Harlan walked over. Pruitt looked up. He looked older than he had in the diner, older than at any point in the last several hours, as if the night had done something to the surface that had been managing his visible age, and the surface was no longer in place. You got one of them grazed, he said. The East Gate guard, my bullet, his shoulder. A muscle worked in his jaw. I hesitated. I should have been faster. You walked into that guard post and you gave us the entry, Harlan said. You took a round doing it. Man who had 30 years of wrong decisions behind him didn't have to do that. He did it anyway. It doesn't undo anything. No, nothing undoes anything. That's not how it works, and you know it. He looked at Pruitt levelly. Patricia Weld needs everything you have. Every detail, every name, every transaction you witnessed or participated in. You give her that without reservation, and she will have what she needs to make every charge stick all the way down the chain. And a judge will know that when it comes time for the things that involve you. Travis, Pruitt said, he'll go through the process. It won't be nothing, but it won't be what it could have been if tonight had gone differently. Pruitt was quiet for a moment. He looked at the ground again and then back up, and there was something in his face that was not redemption, which was too large a word for one night's work, but was the particular quality of a man who has arrived at the first honest position he's occupied in a long time, and understands clearly the distance he's going to have to travel from here. Helen Carver, he said. His voice was rough at the edges. Tell her I'm sorry. I know it doesn't help her. Tell her yourself, Harlan said, when you've served enough time to have earned the right to say it to her face. She's 81 years old, and she's been patient for 20 years. She can wait a little longer for the apology to mean something. Pruitt nodded once. The state police officers flanking him took that as their cue, and he went with them, walking steadily toward the vehicle that would carry him toward the rest of what his life was going to be. The deputy was standing near his own vehicle on the far side of the installation, his weapon already surrendered. A young man with the expression of someone who has just understood the full dimensions of the situation he'd been hired into without being told the full dimensions. He had been on the job 19 months. When Patricia Wells' people came to him, he sat down where they indicated and talked for 3 hours, giving a complete accounting of everything he had witnessed and been instructed to ignore. The charges against him were dropped in exchange for full cooperation. He would leave Copperhead and find work elsewhere, honest work, and spend several years understanding what he had walked into and what it had cost him to walk out of it. Norma Tillman did not wait to be found. She had walked out of the Red Rock Diner the moment Harlan and Pruitt left it, driven to the Copperhead Sheriff's substation, and sat in a plastic chair by the front desk until the overnight deputy, not Pruitt's deputy, but the overnight man who knew nothing about any of it, came out to ask what she needed. She told him she needed to talk to someone from the state. They told her to come back in the morning. She said she would wait. She waited until 6 in the morning when Patricia Wells' advance team arrived ahead of the main convoy. She sat across from one of Wells' investigators and talked for 4 hours without asking for anything in return, answering every question asked, and several that weren't. She received 3 years suspended with community service. She never returned to the diner. The building sat empty for 2 months. The neon sign darkened the parking lot, collecting dust, until Laurel bought it and changed the name and changed what the building was for. Harlan found Laurel where Chet had settled her, on the back step of a state police SUV, with a field dressing above her left temple and a thermal blanket around her shoulders. She looked up when he approached with the expression of someone who is very tired and very recently not dead, and is still in the process of understanding what the second part of that means. "Your dog found me through a concrete wall," she said. "He's done it before." She looked down at Scout, who was sitting at her feet with the resting alert posture he defaulted to when the immediate situation had resolved, but the wider situation remained in progress. "I want to understand how that's possible." "Better nose than anything ever built. 11 years of using it." He sat down on the step beside her, left leg extended. "You were right, by the way. You almost had that bracket free." She made a sound that was almost a laugh and not quite. "I wasn't going to sit there and wait for someone to either save me or not. I've spent 4 months not waiting. I wasn't going to change my approach because someone put me in a concrete room." 4 months of geological surveys on public land," Harlan said. "On your own, knowing what happened to Nathan Carver and doing it anyway." She was quiet for a moment. "Nathan was trying to expose them for what they did to his father. I was trying to document what they were doing to the land, to the public resources, to the permits that exist, because the public is supposed to be protected from exactly this kind of extraction." She looked at her hands in her lap. It was different work for different reasons, and it ended up in the same room, with the same timer. "Chet will take you somewhere safe tonight. Wells' team will want your full documentation tomorrow. 4 months of GPS data and sample analysis is the foundation of the environmental fraud case. Without it, they have the criminal enterprise, but they don't have the full picture of what was being done to this land." "My mother," she said. "She's at home. I'll call Helen. She'll make sure your mother is looked after tonight." He paused. "You'll have options after this. Wells' office has a material witness compensation structure that applies in cases of this scope. It won't be nothing." Laurel looked at the mesa to the north, its dark shape against the slightly lighter sky. Dawn was still 2 hours away, but the quality of the darkness had begun its slow change, that almost imperceptible shift that preceded the visible shift by enough time that only people who had spent time watching for it could detect it. "I came back here for my mother," she said. "And I stayed because I found something wrong and I couldn't unknow it. And now," she stopped finding the right words, "now this place is going to be different. The mine, the permits, the lithium deposits. Someone is going to do something legitimate with all of that eventually. It might as well be documented correctly from the start." "You thinking of staying?" "I'm thinking. I've already spent 4 months learning the geology of this county better than anyone else alive." She looked at him. "Seems inefficient to leave." Patricia Weld came in to find Harlan as the state police vehicles began their systematic processing of the installation, the ordered machinery of documentation and evidence collection, moving through the mine buildings with the thoroughness of an office that had been preparing for exactly this situation for longer than tonight. "We'll need written statements from all 6 of you," she said. "This will take several days to fully process. I'd appreciate your group remaining available in Copperhead." "We've got time," Harlan said. She looked at him for a moment, a direct, assessing look, the look of someone who makes evaluations of people quickly and accurately as a professional requirement. "Your friend Mr. Holt told me about Eddie Carver. about the original complaint, about what Helen Carver went through trying to get someone to act on it. She paused. What Randall Cook did to that case is going to be part of the federal proceeding. It won't be a footnote, it will be a primary count. Good, Harlan said. He walked back toward his bike. Scout fell in at his left side without being called without signal, simply because that was where he always was. The desert air had the particular cold quality of early October mornings, the cold that came before the sun and retreated quickly once the sun arrived, but was complete and specific while it lasted. The stars were still out. Not for much longer, the horizon to the east was making its first faint announcement of intention, but for now they were still there in their full number, the same stars that had been watching this desert since before any human being had walked across it and would be watching it long after the last human footprint had been erased by wind. He thought about Helen sitting in her house 2 miles south on Route 9, waiting with her hands around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, watching the road the way she had watched roads for 20 years. Watching for the arrival of news, for the resolution of the thing that had been unresolved for so long that its resolution had started to feel impossible. He would drive south in an hour, and he would knock on that blue door, and he would tell her. He had been thinking about how to tell her, and he had arrived at the same place he always arrived when he thought too hard about how to say difficult things, which was that the most important things were always said plainly and without preparation, and that any other approach was a way of making the moment about the teller rather than the told. He would say, "It's done. Denton is in custody. The charges will hold. Randall Cook will be arrested before morning." And then she could cry or not cry and say whatever she needed to say, and he would listen for as long as listening was what she needed. He stood beside his Harley in the pre-dawn dark of the Arizona desert and breathed the cold air and felt the weight of the night settling into a different kind of weight. Not the urgency of the last several hours, but something more permanent, the weight of a thing completed, a thing that had been owed for a long time and was now paid. Voiceover: there are two kinds of courage. The first kind is the kind everyone can see, the gun that charged the moment with witnesses. That kind has its place. I'm not dismissing it. I've needed it, and I've used it, and I understand what it costs. But the second kind is the kind that doesn't look like anything from the outside. It looks like a woman driving to Phoenix and walking into an FBI office and telling the truth to a man who had already decided not to hear it. It looks like 20 years of living in the same town as the person who helped cover up your husband's murder and getting up every morning anyway. It looks like 4 months of walking public land alone with a sample kit because the wrong thing was being done and someone who knew better had to document it. Eddie Carver had both kinds. In a warehouse parking lot in 2006 alone at midnight, with headlights coming toward him in the dark, he made the recording anyway. He knew what it would likely cost. He did it anyway because he had decided that the truth being known was worth more than the risk of being the person who made it known. I carried his dog tag for 20 years, and I thought I understood what that meant. I was wrong. You don't understand what a person was until you've finished the thing they started, until you've stood in the place where the debt finally closes. Tonight I stood in that place, and what I understood was that Eddie Carver didn't push me out of the way of that fireball because he calculated that his life was worth less than mine. He did it because that was the kind of man he was. And the only way to honor the kind of man he was is to try for whatever time is left to be that kind of man yourself. That's all there is. That's always been all there is. 6 months later, Copperhead had a different quality to it. Not transformed. Small towns didn't transform on short time scales. But the specific heaviness that had been present in every interaction Harlan had in his first 24 hours in town, the way people watched without meeting eyes, the way conversations stopped when strangers entered rooms, the way certain subjects were navigated around with the practiced care of people who had learned that some topics were expensive, that quality was gone. Or not gone exactly in the way that things learned over decades don't simply stop being learned, but loosening, the ground responding to the removal of the weight that had been pressing on it. Carver's Diner had opened on a Saturday in April and had been full every Saturday since. Harlan parked in his usual spot, which was the spot he'd been using every time he came through Copperhead, which had become a regular occurrence. The ride from Tucson was an hour and 40 minutes on a clear morning, and October in the Sonoran Desert was the best riding weather in the world, and he was 67 years old and had no compelling reason to be anywhere except where he chose to be. Scout jumped down and did his customary sweep of the parking lot. Helen was already at the corner booth. She was always already at the corner booth on Saturdays, the same booth where she had been sitting when Harlan first saw her, and she had coffee in both hands, and the particular expression of someone who has arrived at a thing they'd stopped believing was reachable and is still 6 months later occasionally surprised to find themselves there. He slid in across from her. She pushed the newspaper across without speaking. He looked at the front page. Denton sentenced life without parole. 34 federal counts. The subheading judge calls it one of the most sustained criminal enterprises in state history. He read the first 3 paragraphs. Denton had entered a no-contest plea on 22 of the 34 counts after his legal team assessed the evidence, which was thorough, and his options, which were not. Randall Cook, the retired FBI agent, had received 12 years and was expected to serve 8. Emmett Pruitt had received 7 years under the cooperation agreement and would be eligible for review at 4. His son Travis had received 18 months in an order requiring him to have no contact with Laurel Voss or any resident of Copperhead County. Harlan set the paper down. "Good," he said. Helen looked at her coffee. "He'll die in that prison. His health is already going." She was quiet for a moment. "Does that satisfy me? I've been asking myself that for 6 months. Whether the outcome satisfies me." It's what Eddie deserves," she said. "The truth being formally established. The people responsible facing it in public in a proceeding with their names attached to what they did." She set down her cup. "Whether it's enough is a question I've stopped trying to answer. I don't think enough is a number you arrive at when you've lost what I've lost. But it's right. It's what should have happened 20 years ago. It finally happened." She looked at Harlan. "That matters. Not in a way I can measure, but it matters." Laurel brought coffee without being asked, touched Helen briefly on the shoulder as she passed, moved back to the counter with the ease of someone who had found the work that fit the shape of who she actually was. She had submitted her full geological documentation to Patricia Wells' office in November. The environmental fraud case had added 11 counts to the federal proceeding. She had been invited to present her findings to the State Bureau of Land Management in February and had done so in a conference room in Phoenix with the composed directness of someone who had spent 4 months gathering data under circumstances that had sharpened her relationship with the work considerably. The diner was busy. A Saturday morning in mid-October, families and locals, and a table of people Harlan recognized as part of the Newtown Planning Commission, which had been reconstituted under different management and was conducting itself with the deliberate transparency of an institution that understood it was rebuilding trust from a damaged foundation. The Brotherhood arrived at 9:15, 5 Harleys in the lot. The familiar sequence of engines cutting off. Buck through the door first, then Cal, then Pete and Roy, then Chet, and the space around Helen and Harlan rearranged itself to accommodate them the way it always did now. Chairs appearing from adjacent tables, the booth expanding to become something larger, the room adjusting to the presence of people who needed it to be different and who had earned the adjustment. Buck told a story about a breakdown on the highway outside of Tucson involving a carburetor, a gas station that didn't stock the right parts, and a solution that Roy considered structurally questionable, but that had gotten them 40 miles to the next town, and the telling of it took 12 minutes and was considerably funnier than a roadside carburetor problem had any right to be. Harlan listened to it and to the table's response and felt the particular ease that came from being among people who had been through things with you and had arrived on the other side of those things at the specific kind of friendship that doesn't require maintenance or performance, but simply exists as a condition of the relationship. He was watching the morning light move across the face of the mesa when the diner bell rang. He heard the footsteps before he turned, a particular rhythm, the asymmetry of a gait working around an absence, finding its own pattern and compensation. He had been listening to a version of that rhythm in his own footsteps for 23 years, and he knew it by its quality, by what it communicated about a person who was still negotiating the terms of a new physical reality. The young man who came through the door was maybe 28. Hair growing out from a military cut in the way hair grows when a man is letting the structure of a particular life relax from his body. Army jacket with worn cuffs. A prosthetic right leg newer than Harlan's better materials, carried with the slightly careful quality of someone who hasn't yet reached the point where the body stops thinking about it. His eyes move through the diner the complete way eyes move through unfamiliar spaces when they've been trained to assess them. He found Harlan's table and held it for a moment and looked away, which was not the look of a man registering a stranger, but of a man registering something he recognized and wasn't sure yet how to respond to. He looked lost in the way that had nothing to do with geography. Harlan stood, slowly, the morning stiffness in the prosthetic doing its usual work. He crossed the diner and stopped in front of the young man. "Morning," he said. "You looking for something?" The young man's eyes went to Harlan's left leg to the prosthetic below the jeans, then back up. "Just coffee," he said. Maybe some breakfast. Corner booth in the back. You can see the door from there without having to turn around. Something in the young man's expression registered that information with the specific attention of someone who had needed to know where doors were for reasons that had nothing to do with hospitality. Yeah, he said, thanks. He started past and then stopped. He was looking at the patch on Harlan's jacket. Iron Brotherhood MC Tucson chapter. The wheel and the chain. You ride 42 years. The young man looked at Harlan's leg, back at the patch, with a prosthetic. Custom setup. Took about 6 months to calibrate. After that, it's just riding. Harlan reached into his jacket pocket. He had started carrying cards 6 months ago at Buck's suggestion because Buck was practical about the things that required practicality, and this was one of them. He took one out. White card, plain black letters, Carver Legacy Garage, an address in Copperhead, a phone number, and below that, free riding lessons for veterans. No questions asked. The young man took it, looked at it for a moment. Why free, he said. Because someone did it for me, Harlan said, when I needed it and wasn't sure yet how to ask for help. The young man looked at the card again, then at Harlan. Grady, he said. Grady Weston. Harlan Briggs. He held out his hand. Grady took it with a grip that had been taught correctly and had never forgotten the lesson. Get your coffee, Harlan said. Breakfast too if you want. And if you want to come by the garage, come by. No schedule, no obligation. Just show up. Grady Weston went to the corner booth and sat with his back to the wall and his eyes toward the door, and whatever he was carrying settled around him in the way weather settles, the kind you have to learn to live in rather than avoid. Scout got up from under Harlan's table without direction and crossed the diner and sat down beside the corner booth and looked up at Grady Weston with the complete and patient attention that was simply what Scout did when Scout determined that his attention was what a person needed. Grady looked down at him. His hand left the table and dropped to the dog's head, the instinctive motion of someone reaching for the nearest solid thing. Scout held completely still and let the hand rest there and was present in the way that dogs are present, not offering comfort exactly, but offering the foundational thing that makes comfort possible, which is the simple confirmation that another living thing is here and is not going anywhere. Harlan watched from the counter where he had stopped for a moment. He watched Grady's shoulders drop by a fraction. The small release of something held for a long time. Buck appeared beside him, looked at the corner booth. Another one finding his way back. Yeah, Buck nodded, picked up his coffee, went back to the table without further comment because it didn't require further comment. Harlan's phone buzzed. Unknown number. A text brief and direct in the way that requests for this kind of help tended to be brief and direct because the people who sent them had already used up most of their available composure just getting to the point of asking. Situation in New Mexico. Woman and her grandson. People won't leave them alone. Someone said you might help. Can you come? He looked at it for a moment, looked out the window at his Harley in the October sun chrome, doing what chrome did in desert morning light. Looked at the booth where Helen was reading something Laurel had brought her, something official, holding it in both hands with the expression of someone encountering a piece of paper that confirms a thing they have needed confirmed for a long time. He typed back 4 words. Give me an hour. He walked back to Helen's booth and sat across from her, and they finished their coffee in the comfortable silence of people who have said what needed to be said and arrived somewhere that doesn't require constant filling. Laurel refilled both cups without being asked. The Brotherhood's table continued its easy conversation, Roy and Pete, in their ongoing disagreement about some mechanical question, Buck's voice coming across the top of it, Cal's quiet interjections, Chet reading something on his phone with the focused attention of a man filing information he expects to need later. In the corner booth, Grady Weston ordered breakfast and ate it slowly, and Scout sat beside him the whole time. At 10:15, Harlan stood up. He kissed Helen on the cheek, which he had started doing 6 months ago because it was the right expression of something that had always existed and could now simply be what it was. She held his hand for one moment, said nothing, let go. Outside, the Brotherhood was already at their bikes. Buck had read what he needed to read in Harlan's posture and had simply stood up and put on his jacket and walked out, and the others had followed because that was how it worked and had always worked, and nobody required an explanation for it. Harlan stood at his Harley. The desert went in every direction, enormous in particular, red rock and sage and a sky that deepened at the edges from blue into something closer to the color of depth itself. The mesa to the north had not changed its shape. It would not change its shape. Things that had been here long enough reached a permanence that individual events couldn't touch, and the mesa looked the same as it had when Harlan crossed the Copperhead town line 6 months ago, and the same as it would look in a century, patient, impermanent, and entirely at ease with everything that happened at its feet. He took the dog tags from his jacket pocket, both of them warm from being against his chest. His name on one, Eddie Carver's name on the other, worn smooth by 20 years of handling, the letters shallow now, but still they're still readable if you knew how to look. He looked at Eddie's name. He thought about a man sitting alone in a car in a dark parking lot 20 years ago, talking into a camera, already understanding that the following week would probably be his last. Already thinking about Helen when he said her name, that roughening in his voice that the recording had captured and kept. Already making the decision to leave a record for the people who would need it, not for himself because he understood that he wouldn't be the one who needed it, but for them. He put the dog tags back, reached down, 3 taps on the left leg, tap, 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 still here, still standing, still paying what was owed. Scout jumped up behind him and settled into the familiar position, every mile of their 11 years together present in how completely he fit into the space. And Harlan started the engine, and the sound of it came up through the chassis and through his hands on the handlebars and through everything that the machine and the man and the dog had become over 42 years of a road, that particular combination of mechanical inevitability and something that wasn't quite music but wasn't not music either. The sound that still did the same thing to the space behind his ribs that it had always done. Buck pulled out first. Cal, Pete, and Roy together. Chet last. 6 Harleys on the road out of Copperhead, heading south toward the highway chrome, catching the morning light, the sound of them building as they moved together, and then beginning to fade as the road curved away. And from inside the diner through the window, Helen watched them go, and Laurel stood beside her shoulder to shoulder. Both of them watching until the last of the sound dissolved into the desert, and what remained was the ordinary morning quiet of a town that was slowly and genuinely becoming something better than what it had been. In the corner booth, Grady Weston looked up from his breakfast and watched the last chrome flash disappear around the bend. He looked at the card in his hand for a long moment. Then he put it in his jacket pocket next to his chest, where things that mattered were kept. Voiceover Eddie Carver asked me once the night before we went into Fallujah what we were doing there. Not the official answer, the real one. What was the actual thing we were there for? I said freedom. He shook his head. He said we're doing this so the people we love don't have to. I argued with him. I said that was the same thing, just smaller. He said no, it's not smaller. It's exactly the size it's supposed to be. I've spent 20 years understanding what he meant by that. The answer wasn't in the doing of large things. It wasn't in the clearing of names or the closing of cases or the bringing down of men who had built their power on the destruction of other people's ordinary lives, though all of that mattered and needed doing. The answer was in a corner booth in a diner named after my best friend, where a young man who had come home broken was sitting with his hand on a dog's head and eating breakfast, and beginning without knowing, he was beginning to find his way back to himself. That was the size it was supposed to be. That was what Eddie understood that I did not in Fallujah, not at the funeral, not in 20 years of carrying his name against my chest. Right now, this morning, riding south on Route 9 with my brothers around me and the desert going on in every direction and New Mexico waiting at the end of the next road. That was what he meant. The people we love, the size it's supposed to be. Semper Fidelis, always faithful. That's all. That's everything. The road opened ahead, the Harleys disappeared into the morning. And in Carver's diner in the corner booth where the light came through the window, warm and particular and unrepeatable, a young man ate his breakfast and breathed the air of a place that was still becoming what it was going to be. And outside the mesa stood in its permanent patience against the October sky, and the desert held everything that had happened in the only way the desert held things, which was completely and without judgment, in the deep red ground and the still air and the silence that had been here before any of it, and would be here long after, waiting for nothing, needing nothing, simply and entirely there.